Hello everybody, and welcome to the live broadcast of the undocking and deorbit of Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley from the ISS on Crew Dragon. So, I had a little technical difficulty here a minute ago. Let me just make sure that I had to restart my streaming software, so let me make sure that the video is configured correctly. Here we go, okay. So welcome. This is going to be a long stream because unlike the trip uphill on launch, the trip downhill, as they call it, back to splashdown in the Gulf of Mexico is going to take the better part of a day. So they're going to undock. Well, first of all, they're going to seal the hatch up in, I don't know, an hour and some odd minutes. And then in a couple hours after that, they will undock from the space station in Crew Dragon. And then the splashdown is not actually until tomorrow afternoon. Hopefully that statement doesn't lose me a bunch of viewers. But yeah, the splashdown isn't until tomorrow afternoon, but the stream will continue. It'll be a continuous live stream throughout, courtesy of NASA and SpaceX. So, let's see if we have any questions already. Hello, Charles Goddard II, and everyone else, welcome. In fact, I will type welcome in the chat to everyone from around the world, as we always have an international audience here. Fatzilla, hello in Danish. I don't know how to pronounce that, though. Yep, I just verified. I don't hear any echo here either. So make sure that you only have one stream running. So this live Q&A is preceding the official broadcast by about a half hour. And so in... Oh, where's my countdown? At 5:15 Eastern, which is in 20-some minutes, the official coverage will begin. Coverage begins at 17:30. Start. Countdown timer. There we go. Very nice. 40 minutes. Nope, I got that time wrong. It is at 5:15, not 5:30. There we go. That's better. 24 minutes. All right. So... as usual, I'm wearing all the hats here, so if I am kind of scattered, it's because I'm multitasking, trying to manage the stream as well as narrate, commentate, and calculate and dominate. Claire Pastrick, the splashdown is not going to be postponed according to the latest information I have seen from SpaceX. So what we can do here, rather than just showing my face, is I can show you SpaceX's Twitter. So this was posted when? At 1:52 p.m. Oh, let's see. Nope, I thought there was one after that. 2 hours, 19 hours. Okay, so this was posted a couple of hours ago. Crew Dragon will depart the space station with Astro Behnken and Astro Doug in about 6 hours from 2 hours ago, and splash down off the coast of Florida in the Gulf of Mexico at 2:41 p.m. Eastern on Sunday, August 2nd. Now, if we go to... Here, let me get this link. So this is the, yes, of course I want to go to the site. This is the raw space calendar I'm going to. The link is in the chat. If we look at more details, let's go to the, oh, okay. Okay, so live Q&A, that's what we're in the middle of. 5:15 p.m. Eastern, live coverage begins from NASA and SpaceX jointly. 5:45 is the hatch opening. I'm sorry, the hatch closing. 7:34 p.m. is undocking, and then 2:42 p.m. tomorrow is the splashdown. Does that correlate with what the 2:41 p.m.? So looks like they moved ahead the splashdown by 1 minute. So there you go. Okay, Jay Charist is asking how the weather looks in the recovery zone. Let's take a look, shall we? I actually haven't checked it out myself, but all right, so let's say recovery zone. Let's say I don't know, Tampa, Florida, because that's on the Gulf Coast. Radar. So here we have Florida currently, and in the future, it has to load the Saturday 8 p.m. Saturday 10 p.m. Okay, so let's look at the 10-day forecast for Tampa. Oh gosh, kidding me. I don't even know. Do I even have ad block in how stupid. You know what? Phooey on the Weather Channel. I'll go to the Weather Underground. Ugh, 93 degrees. No, thank you. All right, tonight, tomorrow night. Let's look at the hourly. Now, I'm not sure what the coordinates of the splashdown will be. How close to, like, whether this is going to be anywhere close to Tampa or further north or further south. But wherever it is, I'm just using Tampa as an example. So this is Sunday, tonight, tomorrow. Okay. Tomorrow, Sunday, 2 p.m. Ew. Thunderstorms. 67% chance of precipitation. So it looks like there's a window here of a window here of thunderstorms between noon and 5 p.m., at least in Tampa. Again, especially with a hurricane or a tropical storm or whatever this thing is nearby, conditions can change significantly with not much distance. So like from 11 to 12 here, the weather changes significantly. So I'm sure that once we get into the live broadcast, they'll let us know specifically what the forecast is for the, because it's been a big concern of everyone. And it'll also affect how Bob and Doug, well, it'll affect, once they splash down, it'll affect their level of nausea, because the seas will be potentially rough. Although I don't think the Gulf gets as bad as the Atlantic. But all right, so let's see if we can find any more questions. Somebody asked Waterloo. Oh, Stanislav Tihohad. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that. Why do you Americans, darn Americans, love water landings so much? So originally, the original plan for Crew Dragon was to have it land on land using the 4 pairs of 2, totaling 8 Super Draco thrusters to propulsively cushion the landing. But due to complications in the process of getting it engineered and tested and certified, most importantly certified for human spaceflight by NASA, they chose to go with water landings instead. So it comes down in the water. And this will, in fact, when they splash down, this will be the first human water landing in 40 years or something like that. In fact, since the space shuttle, in any case. So Brad Gaming asks, if you don't mind me asking off topic, what were your thoughts on Perseverance? I hope and pray that it reaches the red planet intact, keeps communicating, and has a successful 7 minutes of terror on its descent through the Martian atmosphere and lands softly upon its surface, so that our years of effort and many dollars of investment can be put to use in studying Mars. Mars missions are hard, but we've had a good track record the past bunch of missions. But over the course of the past half century, Mars has eaten a lot of probes from many different countries. So hoping for the best, and if it does land successfully, then I expect that we'll get a number of years, or number of sols, Martian sols, of amazing data from it. And it'll be very interesting to see the Ingenuity drone flying around, because we've never had such a thing before. It'll be the first rotor craft on another world. Of course, you can't have one on the moon because there's no atmosphere. But the Martian atmosphere is quite thin. It's only a few percent of the density of Earth's atmosphere, but of the pressure of Earth's atmosphere. But it is still something. It's enough to for the rotor blades to grab onto. I haven't personally seen any videos of the testing of the Ingenuity drone, like in vacuum chambers. I'm sure there are videos of that floating around somewhere. I should look them up. Who's Your Daddy asks, are they using the net to catch the capsule? No, they are not. Crew Dragon, remember a few months ago, or it was last year, last fall, winter, they did the DM-1, the Demonstration Mission 1, unmanned test flight of Crew Dragon up to the space station with Ripley, the mannequin. And when it came down, it came down on parachutes, and it just splashed down in the ocean. It doesn't... I don't even remember your question, but the answer is no. Let's see. Peyton House asks, when SpaceX will launch Crew 1? I don't have the exact... You know what? Let me look it up. We have the power of the internet. Manned spacecraft. Shenzhou. Starliner. They must not have it on here. Okay. Oh, you can't see that because I've got my face up on the screen. October, maybe? That's what I kind of vaguely recollect. I'm sure someone will mention it in the chat. Not for a few months in any case. But when they do send the Crew 1 mission, it will be with 4 crew. In fact, NASA has announced the crew, I think, of this and the next production manned Crew Dragon flights. And they will be full-fledged expeditionary crews of 4 members, and they'll stay for the regular 6, 7, 8, 9 months that expedition crews normally stay. Now, Bob and Doug, I didn't even mention this before. I should have. So Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley, even though they're veteran astronauts of the shuttle program, and they've been on many spacewalks, and their wives are astronauts, they this particular flight, they launched on May 30th. So that was 63 days ago, unless my calculations are off. And originally, they were not planned to stay on the station so long. They were only going to stay for like a week, test out the Crew Dragon systems, and then come home. But because, number one, Chris Cassidy he needed the help around the station because he was the only American on the station until Bob and Doug arrived. The other two crew were cosmonauts, Russian cosmonauts. And also the fact that they were able to use a more robust Crew Dragon module, the second iteration, because the first module, it blew up on the pad in an incident last year, which delayed everything. But so in other words, they were able to use a more robust Crew Dragon spacecraft, and therefore they were able to stay on the station longer for 2 months instead of just a week. Let's see. Jimbo Thunderhawk asks, there's a big parking lot next to my house. Can they land there? Well, technically, it's possible to land anywhere. It may not be a survivable landing, but they can certainly land there. But that's not where they're aiming for. They're aiming for the Gulf off the West Florida coast. Kevin Still says we haven't landed in water in over 45 years. I'm a few minutes behind. Let me get caught up here. I talk too much. Kick him out of the airplane. Okay. Yeah, so MVM Motovlog Music. By the way, it's good to see all the regulars back here in the chat, as always, as well as the new folks. Welcome. He says it is not intended to be caught by Ms. Tree or Ms. Chief, which are the two the two vessels that SpaceX uses with the giant 200-foot nets on them to catch the payload fairings. Those are only used on for launches, because the payload fairing is the shell that covers the payload of the rocket, the Falcon rocket, when it goes up, and then the two halves, like a clamshell, they open up and fall away, fall back down to Earth. Now, with most rockets, the fairings are just debris. They just either burn up or splash down or crash down wherever. But SpaceX has developed the process of using these two ships, these two swift boats with these huge nets on them, to catch the payload fairings. And it's tricky. I'm sorry, I've got some allergies that are getting me. It's tricky, but they've had some good success the past few times, catching either one or both of the fairing halves. But that only applies to the payload fairing, and there is no payload fairing this time because they're going to detach from the station sometime later before deorbit. They're going to jettison the trunk, which is the storage area under the crew module of Crew Dragon. And the trunk will just burn up, but Crew Dragon itself will then come down in a blaze of glory and descend on parachutes and safely splash down. Jimbo Thunderhawk also asks, will they need to change their shorts after splashdown? Now, I imagine that one of the things that astronauts do enjoy doing after they return from space is changing into a fresh set of clothes. However, I don't think that they will need to do so because they have soiled anything. These are tough guys. They're both test pilots, very experienced, lots of experience in space. They've gone up in the space shuttle. I believe they've both gone up on Soyuz modules. I'd have to look at their pages to see their histories to see. But Soyuz is a rough ride. Soyuz is not for the faint of heart. And then it leaves you sore after you come down. It's a cushioned landing, but it's not baby soft. Lisa Curiel asks, when is splashdown? So if you refer to the video description, then the splashdown is at 2:42 or 2:41 p.m. tomorrow. So it's going to be a long stream. I'm not going to be online. I'm not going to be on the air like myself for the duration, but the stream will remain. I may come on at some point, but in any case, NASA and SpaceX will have content for you to consume while they descend, as they did during their ascent. That's right. Yes, trolls beware. Rockin' Robbins 13 is wielding his ban hammer, and it is relentless. Mark Taylor asks, what happened with the solar panel thing behind the Dragon? So the solar panels on Crew Dragon are mounted to the trunk, and the trunk will be jettisoned prior to deorbit. So they receive their power from the solar panels. I mean, the solar panels recharge their batteries, but when it's time to deorbit, they jettison the trunk with the solar panels, which will then end up just burning up and in the atmosphere. And then the Crew Dragon performs their deorbit maneuver and comes down, you know, in plasma and flame. Magical Ducks asks, hey, Raw Space, do you actually eat your space raw, or do you just cook it on a cast iron pan? I do. In fact, I prefer my beef to be cooked medium most of the time, but my space I definitely prefer raw. Such as it is, because there's very little substance to it, and it's very difficult to cook. It takes some real talent. But the sun does a good job of cooking space for us. The Doctor asks, what happens if they go off course? And if so, how far off course could they go? So in space, your trajectory is determined by the direction you're traveling in and your speed and your mass, basically, which is negligible compared to what you're orbiting, which is, you know, the Earth. But basically it's based on your direction and speed. When you deorbit, your timing needs to be precise, but that's all programmed. Your thrust needs to be precise, in the right direction, at the right angle. I mean, and your angle, the angle that you're facing doesn't really matter in space, but the angle of your thrust matters very much. And the angle of the re-entry interface when they start kissing the atmosphere is important, because the heat shield needs to be oriented such that the intense 35-ish 100-degree heat that's generated in this plasma sheath around the craft, which is why they lose communications with re-entering capsules, because the plasma prevents the radio signals from getting through, because it's ionized. You know, so you need to be at the correct angle in order for the heat shield to do its job properly. And as far as going off course, I mean, they can't steer once they're coming down. So if they re-enter at the correct angle in the correct location, then they're going to come down in the right spot. I mean, conceivably, you know, they could be blown around within a range of area while they're dangling under the parachutes, but that's why they don't land like 10 feet offshore. They land many miles offshore, where they have room for some wiggle room, because once you get in the atmosphere, there can be some variability in your landing. Now, the way the SpaceX sorry, just got to get ready here. The way the SpaceX Falcon boosters come down, they are guided, once they come back in the atmosphere, they're guided by, or they're steered rather, by the not only by the gimbaling of the engine, but by the titanium grid fins that are so prominently shown in the videos we see. So let me cue this up. All right, we've got about 3 minutes until the live coverage starts. That looks pretty good. All right. I'm sorry I'm not talking. I've got to get this ready for you because this is why you're here. And the pizza just arrived. That's cool. Saved by the bell. Fortunately, my best friend is here, and he's going to go get the food. All right. Looks like we're good to go. Okay, so we've got a stream. All right, any last minute questions in the 2 minutes that remain? Oh, yeah, no, Chef Mime, no, the earth is not flat, you're wrong, and politics are not allowed in the chat. No politics, no religion, none of those contentious topics. Regardless of what side you're on. Oh, speaking of, I should mention the rules. All right. Denise Campbell says, I look so tired. Yeah, this has been a crazy week. I'm gonna do a SpaceWeek episode tomorrow, and that will be, I guess, very shortly after the end of this stream, because they come down at 2 something, and then the SpaceWeek may be delayed a little bit. I'll have to play it by ear. There's also, I think, another live stream tomorrow. I'll have to check. But in any case, I am tired. My sleep schedule, I foobarred it last night. It's totally whacked. And shame on me for that. I had intended to shave for this occasion, but I did not. So I'm looking a little scruffy. Sorry for that. But it is, you know, COVID quarantine, so scruffiness is the order of the day. Mike S. asks why they're taking so long to actually touch down. I think that they're taking extra time so that they can continue to test out the Crew Dragon's systems. I mean, they did some of that on the way up, and I believe they're doing more of it on the way down. You know, because this is in fact a test flight. It's just a long test flight because they remained on station for 2 months. So I think normally, yeah, I think for normal missions they won't need to wait like 20 hours or 18 hours or whatever it is before deorbiting. But you know, we shall see when Crew 1 and Crew 2 come around. So, also, I apologize ahead of time. Because of the quirks of YouTube, I am going to have to, if music comes on the stream, which it's inevitable when they play pre-recorded video segments, you know, during their broadcast, a lot of times they have background music. I'm going to have to dub over that audio, and I'm sorry for that. I mean, if it's just music, then no biggie. But if it includes narration, then, you know, whatever their pre-recorded video clip contains, you won't be able to hear. And I know that will get some complaints, but just be forewarned. So here we go, and please do enjoy the show, and Godspeed to Bob and Doug. Thank you for coming, and stick around. It'll be a long ride.
Good afternoon. It's Saturday, August 1st here at SpaceX headquarters in Hawthorne, California. And on your screen is a live view of the interior of the Dragon spacecraft as we await its departure from the International Space Station. Now, we expect Dragon to push away from the space station with NASA astronauts Bob Behnken, who's actually in the frame right now, and Doug Hurley on board just after 4:35 p.m. Pacific time to make their way back home to planet Earth. My name is Shiva Bharadwaj, and I'm a space operations engineer here at SpaceX, and I'm really excited to be bringing you live coverage today of Crew Dragon as it completes its very first trip to space with people on board as part of our second demonstration mission for NASA. And joining me today is NASA Public Affairs Officer Leah Cheshire.
Thanks for having me, Shiva. It really is great to be back here for this historic milestone moment in NASA's Commercial Crew program. Once Dragon departs station, Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley's flight home is expected to last roughly 19 hours. That'll include 4 departure burns that move Dragon away from station, a phasing burn to lower its orbit and line the spacecraft up with its landing location, and 1 final deorbit burn. Their trip home will also include an 8-hour sleep period later tonight, where both crew members will be able to get some rest before their arrival back on Earth tomorrow after a little more than 2 months in space. Dragon is targeted to splash down off the coast of Pensacola, Florida in the Gulf of Mexico tomorrow at 11:48 a.m. Pacific time, followed by the crew getting picked up at sea by one of SpaceX's recovery vessels.
Now, the mission began about 2 months ago on May 30th from historic Launch Pad 39A at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. And after a successful separation from the Falcon 9, Bob and Doug enjoyed a 19-hour flight on board Dragon before they came to the International Space Station. Now, since arriving, Bob and Doug have been doing some real work aboard the station. In fact, Bob and Station Commander Chris Cassidy completed several spacewalks, and they've also been taking some really spectacular photos of planet Earth and the Dragon spacecraft as it's been in attached operations. We'll have a chance to share some of those later on in the broadcast.
And I can't believe it, but it's already been 63 days since they arrived in space, so they are just entering the final phase of their mission in just a few hours from now and have been preparing for over the last 2 weeks for their return flight. Today on board the space station is the Expedition 63 crew, led by NASA's Chris Cassidy and joined by Russian cosmonauts Anatoly Ivanishin and Ivan Wagner, and of course, Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley.
Now, while all the crew have been busy aboard, the ground teams have also been performing a number of checkouts in preparation for departure today. These checkouts have been going on over the last several days, and in fact, last week. They've included inspections of the heat shield, checkouts of the suits, some checkouts of the comm systems, as well as a number of activation procedures on the life support system on the vehicle, and cargo loading, which has been really cool. Actually, why don't we check in with Gary at Johnson Space Center? He can let us know how the station crew have been preparing and what we can expect from here. Gary?
Thank you, Shiva and Leah, and welcome inside the International Space Station Flight Control Room. Since arriving at the space station, Bob and Doug jumped right in as fully fledged members of Expedition 63. Over the last 2 months, they've helped execute more than 24 scientific investigations from every major category of research aboard the station, including studies in biology and biotechnology, earth and space sciences, human research, physical sciences, and technology demonstration. They've also had plenty of non-science-related work on their timelines, performing maintenance on life support and vehicle hardware in multiple modules and transferring cargo in and out of the attached HTV-9 cargo spacecraft. Bob Behnken also executed 4 spacewalks with Station Commander Chris Cassidy, wrapping up one of the final phases of upgrading the station's large external batteries, with Doug assisting in all suit and robotic operations. Since completing the spacewalks, Bob and Doug have spent the last 2 weeks preparing to come home. They received some additional on-orbit training to refresh them on the departure, re-entry, and splashdown procedures, and have been busy packing cargo for their return. In fact, that's what they're doing right now. There will be approximately 150 kilograms or 330 pounds of cargo returning on Dragon. The majority of that is more than 200 pounds of science, largely made up of samples packed away into powered cold freezers. These samples are from a range of biological research experiments on the station dedicated to improving our understanding of how the human body adapts to microgravity, or looking at ways to use space to improve life back here on Earth. Now, let's go through some of the major upcoming milestones for today's departure coming up soon at just around 2:35 p.m. Pacific. We're currently awaiting Bob and Doug to ingress or board the station, or board the Dragon for their return flight home. They're doing a little bit of closeout duties now, but that'll be one of the first items on their agenda today. So less than 30 minutes from now, they'll be closing Dragon's hatch around 2:45 p.m. Pacific time. Once inside the vehicle, Bob and Doug will don their SpaceX spacesuits, which will be worn during all dynamic phases of the flight. All those same leak checks on the spacecraft would occur before the crew makes their way into the seats and straps in for undocking. Once the Dragon's hatch is closed, Chris Cassidy will affix a docking target to the outside of the A-Pass hatch and then close it about 10 minutes later, 2:55 p.m. Pacific, creating a space between the Dragon and station known as the vestibule. He then has one more hatch to close. That's the Node 2 forward hatch. Now, after all of those hatches are closed, about 15 minutes later, a ground command will be sent to open the valves on the Dragon side and begin depressurization. That's at 3:10 p.m. Pacific, essentially venting air inside and bringing that space down close to vacuum. They have to pause for 5 psi for a few minutes, allowing the temperature inside that vestibule to stabilize, perform a good leak check, and then continue depressurization. 4:20 p.m. Central Time, they'll conduct a go, no-go poll. That'll be the NASA teams here in Mission Control Houston and SpaceX teams in Hawthorne. If all is go, the undocking sequence begins. The undocking command will be sent, followed by a few minutes for the umbilical that connects the power and data between the two spacecraft to detach. 12 hooks will retract, and then 2 firings of Dragon's thrusters will initiate, and the undocking will be complete. That separation scheduled for 4:34 p.m. Pacific time. Now, the departure burn, there's 4 departure burns. Immediately after those 2 burns, they'll actually have that physical separation, and the departure burns will take them around the zenith side of the International Space Station. Those departure burns taking place, there's 4 of them, and will be taking place over the first few hours of their flight, essentially getting that Dragon further away from the International Space Station. Now, overnight, the crew will be able to get a sleep period in. In fact, this orbital trajectory gives them plenty of time to allow for the crew's sleep, to get them in a good circadian rhythm, and allow them to perform all of their tasks prior to splashdown, including while they are asleep. They're going to also be performing a phase burn. Right now, they're in the orbital plane of the International Space Station, but that phase burn will align them with their primary landing site. Right now, we're looking go for Pensacola, just off the coast of Pensacola, Florida. They'll perform a series of checks right upon waking up when that phase burn occurs while they are asleep. Those checks, they'll put on their suits and get ready for the deorbit sequence. The deorbit sequence is, there's a few steps there. First, there's going to be the preparation for the claw separation. There's a Dragon's trunk. They're going to perform a heavy yaw of the Dragon vehicle and release the Dragon trunk off to the side so it doesn't intersect with the vehicle during the deorbit sequence. Align Dragon back up with the orbital plane and fire the forward bulkhead Dracos. This will be one of the longest burns, and that is the deorbit burn, almost more than actually 11 minutes long. And that will slow them down enough. They'll position Dragon for re-entry into Earth's atmosphere, and then the re-entry sequence will begin. Of course, before they do that, they do have to close the nose cone. So after they close the nose cone, they'll go through the atmosphere, shoot the drogue parachutes, main parachutes, and then splash down. That's scheduled for tomorrow afternoon, Sunday afternoon, around 1:48 p.m. Central Time, 11:48 a.m. Pacific Time. Then the recovery operations begin. After that, Bob and Doug will be back on planet Earth. Now, Station Commander Chris Cassidy will be watching the undocking and departure burn from the cupola, but the prime monitoring role falls to Bob and Doug. Flight controllers in Mission Control Houston will be backing them up. Now, as you've heard several times, Dragon's flight is intended to be autonomous, but the crew on board has the ability to take control and maneuver Dragon during the departure if necessary. On the station side, we're looking good. Solar arrays are locked in place. We have good communication links, and all station systems are looking healthy. Attitude will remain on U.S. control until the time of undocking, when we'll switch to control moment gyros only. We're tracking no issues for an on-time departure here in Mission Control Houston. Now back to Shiva and Leah in Hawthorne.
crew has actually been really busy all day as they have been preparing to leave. Got up this morning. It's actually evening on the International Space Station right now. And they got up and started working out. All the astronauts on the space station have to work out for 2 hours a day every day to make sure that they keep up their bone strength and their muscle strength so that way they can walk when they get back home. And so they got up, got the opportunity to do that. Bob Behnken transferred some emergency equipment from Dragon into the space station. They keep that emergency equipment in there just in case they ever needed to make a quick, speedy getaway in Dragon or take a safe haven in that space in case something were to happen in the International Space Station.
Yeah, and Leah, you mentioned the idea of safe haven. Actually, a couple of the visiting vehicles, either the Soyuz vehicle and the Dragon vehicle, when they're attached to the space station, can provide the crew with a place to hole up if there were an emergency on the station or if there was a leak or a fire or depressurization event. And so some of that emergency equipment is stored in the vehicle for quick access in case they needed to get inside very quickly. And the crew actually train pretty rigorously on those emergency scenarios, getting in quickly under all kinds of visibility scenarios and checking that their crewmates are safely aboard in their vehicles as well. We had a chance to do some training with the crew actually here in Hawthorne earlier for the Crew 1 crew earlier this month. So, and just a quick recap of kind of what's coming up next. So Bob and Doug going through the ingress operations right now. Coming up, planned about 2:35 p.m. Pacific time is hatch closure. So that's where we will close the forward hatch on the Dragon spacecraft. And then following that will be closure of the APAS hatch.
And after we close the APAS hatch there, that's on the space station side. We'll have the space station crew be working on that. We'll go for vestibule depressurization, and the vestibule is that space in between the hatches that the crew flies through when they arrive and then, of course, when they leave. But we are going to bring that space, which is at the same pressurization as the rest of the space station, down to as close to a vacuum as possible because that's what it will be exposed to once Crew Dragon departs, hopefully in just a couple of hours.
Yeah, right now the planned departure and separation is looking like around 4:34 or 4:35 p.m. Pacific time. And that's when we're hoping to see Dragon do some small undocking burns that will separate it from the space station. On your screen is actually a view from inside the space station looking down node 2 towards the pressurized mating adapter. I think I saw Chris Cassidy in the view there, and I think those are his other expedition crewmates on board.
Yes.
And Bob and Doug probably inside the capsule at this point.
Yes, that looks to be Chris Cassidy over on the left, and then Anatoly Ivanishin and Yvonne Wagner upside down, or what feels like upside down to us, but really there's no up or down in space.
That's got to be nice.
Yeah, I know, right? And both the hatches still open, so we'll be waiting for that hatch closure.
Yeah, and actually, I think you can see that's probably the APAS hatch. If you look just past where all the ISS crew are, I believe that's the APAS hatch that's sort of coming up, kind of that white circle. And Chris Cassidy will actually have some tasks to attach a docking target onto that when we're ready to close the APAS hatch. Looks like he might be hopping into Dragon to help out with some work inside the capsule for securing. Now, we mentioned earlier today, Bob and Doug have been busy today. They've actually been busy as well stowing cargo on board the vehicle. Just listening into the nets right now, it looks like they're actually going through life support activation. So I just heard a call out that carbon dioxide levels are coming down, which means that our life support system is actively taking in air from the cabin and revitalizing it so Bob and Doug can breathe nicely on board.
So just some statistics while we're thinking about it. Obviously, we mentioned that Crew Dragon has been on board the station for 63 days now. Feels like yesterday. And during that time, Bob and Doug have traveled over 27 million statute miles around the Earth. So
that's incredible.
Frequent flyers, I would say.
Yeah. Do you get is there a frequent flyer pass for Dragon? I hope so. Yeah, they're zipping around. I think on ground track they're going about 17,500 kilometers when they're at ISS's orbital altitude. If that sounds about right.
Yeah, I think it's 17,500 miles an hour.
I'm sorry, miles per hour. Thank you.
It's still extremely fast. So if you look just above the hatch, you see that ISS 20 flag. That is representing the 20th anniversary of the International Space Station, which we will actually be celebrating later this year. So for the past 20 years, I like to explain it to people as if you are under 20 years of age, you've never lived a day without humans in space. So for the past 20 years, we've had continuous human presence aboard the International Space Station. It's truly international. We have obviously our two upside down friends we see. They're getting a better look inside by turning in that direction. They are from Roscosmos, the Russian space agency. Looks like they are taking out the intermodule ventilation. That helps equalize the air in between Dragon's capsule and the rest of the International Space Station.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, while Dragon has been attached to the space station, most of its operations have been in what we call quiescent mode. So that's really just a low power state where we've only got monitoring on the thermal system, the propellant system, taking a look at some parameters in case we were to see anything that would trigger the Dragon's onboard automation to wake the vehicle up and let ground operators know something needs to be addressed. The onboard life support system is actually only used when we close the hatches and for brief periods when we are configuring the vehicle when we first arrive and periods when we're leaving, like right now. So that duct that they pull out, the intermodule ventilation duct, that actually provides clean, breathable air and circulates the air in the capsules, and providing that air from the International Space Station.
And it looks like hatch closure is soon to be underway.
Houston and Hawthorne from Endeavour.
Still
We're
working to
closing
take
the
out
forward
some
hatch.
equipment inside Dragon, move it back into the space station.
Yeah, so as part of those activities, moving the intermodule ventilation duct, they activated, of course, the lithium hydroxide scrubbers on board Dragon. Cap and fan has been running. And I think we're just waiting on confirmation of hatch closure.
Yes, and I think they just called down that they are working on that, putting that into motion. We're getting one step closer to sending Bob and Doug home.
Closed for Endeavour.
SpaceX copies.
And Houston copies.
And we just got confirmation that Capsule Endeavour has closed the forward hatch. We can actually see on our screen the activities to close the APAS hatch as well.
And that Crew Dragon hatch closure came at 2:36 p.m. Pacific time as the International Space Station was flying over the North Atlantic Ocean.
Now, as part of hatch closure operations, Bob and Doug actually inspected the seal on the interior surface of the forward hatch on Dragon. And we're talking about the forward hatch and the side hatch. The forward hatch is actually the part that's attached to the front, sort of the front portion of the International Space Station. So if you imagine the International Space Station flying in a direction around the Earth, the forward direction of it is what we're attached to. And that, if you were imagining the capsule sitting on the rocket, is actually at the very top of the rocket underneath the nose cone. So if you're imagining the rocket as it was on the launch pad, it's a little bit sideways right now. And there's a sealing surface on that forward hatch that Bob and Doug would have done an inspection on just to make sure that there's no foreign object debris or FOD that could cause a potential leak. And here's an internal view of the Dragon spacecraft. We've got Bob in his, looks like his comfort garment, which would be what he wears underneath his suit. Nice to see the capsule getting all packed up.
And then another view from the International Space Station side of things. Looks like Anatoly Ivanishin flying out of view and Chris Cassidy down there in between the hatches in that vestibule area. He is working through procedures to soon be closing the APAS hatch on the space station side and prepare for depressurization.
Dragon, SpaceX, no response.
Yeah, and so we
required.
talked about this a little bit.
External on cameras for your suit donning.
Copy, SpaceX. Thank you.
Now, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but the vestibule, the space between the APAS hatch and the forward hatch on Dragon is really just a small volume that is normally exposed to the vacuum of space when we don't have a visiting vehicle like the Dragon spacecraft. And we have to step through some depressurization steps once we have confirmed that all of those hatches are secured, both on the International Space Station side as well as on the Dragon side of the spacecraft.
So we just heard the call that Bob and Doug are go for suit donning. So the Dragon hatch is closed. They've said farewell to their orbiting friends for now until they're all reunited in the ground in the future. And they'll be going through that suit donning shortly. You did mention it looked like Bob Behnken was already in his comfort garment, that first layer of the suit.
Yeah, the comfort garment is it's basically like an athletic garment. Just helps them stay comfortable before they step into the suit. And the suit is largely a one-piece design. So the helmet is integrated into it. The boots are integrated into it. Really, they will unzip some interfaces on the suit, climb into it, zip all those attachment points up, and then there's actually an umbilical on the leg of the suit. So it's a kind of a connection that provides gases and electrical connections to the suit, so they can use the integrated microphones in their helmets, and it also provides them breathable gases for suit leak checks, and if we were to have one of those emergency scenarios, it would also provide pressurization to the suit. And I think notable to mention that these are different suits from what you might imagine for like the spacewalks and EVA suits. These are what are called intravehicular activity suits, meant for really activity inside the vehicle.
So what we just saw as Chris Cassidy was down there in between the hatches in that vestibule space, he was affixing that docking target that we mentioned earlier. I like to say it's like an X marks the spot because that's what the vehicles aim for when they arrive at the International Space Station. So one step closer to bring in Bob and Doug home. And we're actually really fortunate that the weather has turned out pretty good in the Gulf. Looking at a Pensacola landing site right now, we just, before we went on air today, we had the 2.5 hour prior to undocking weather briefing, and things are still looking good for an on-time departure today.
Yeah, really glad to see the weather cleared up. Storm moved back towards the Atlantic. Which opens up our opportunities for landing sites in the Gulf of Mexico, which Gary had actually mentioned earlier, Pensacola being the primary site today.
Yeah, so as they continue work on the APAS hatch, let's check in with Gary over on the International Space Station Mission Control Room side of things.
Stand by, Gary.
Thank you, Leah. We're watching the same view that you are seeing, Chris Cassidy working on that APAS hatch on the International Space Station side, as you saw that hatch on the Dragon side closed. Now, this is an important set of procedures that Cassidy is working right now. You already mentioned the docking target. This is that rod with the X at the end of it. X marks the spot. As Leah mentioned, this is an important item to affix to that APAS hatch. Now, you see he set up a camera just outside of there, and he's also going to be taking some pictures for the ground teams to know exactly how the APAS was configured prior to closing, getting ready for some of those next crews. Now, you saw there was a white padding on the outside of it too. That's just for a safety measure as the crew was moving in between the hatches, but everything going according to plan here. That APAS hatch expected to be closed about 10 minutes after closing the Dragon hatch, which was closed just about 10 minutes ago. So it should be closing very soon. The crew already just a little bit ahead of that timeline. So a few items coming up after that APAS hatch closure. Now you see that hatch is on the station side. There's going to be a space in between the Dragon hatch and the International Space Station hatch. That space is called the vestibule. So about 15 minutes after they close that APAS hatch, they'll give a go for depressurization of that vestibule. That is all controlled from the Dragon side. But we'll be watching very closely here in Mission Control Houston. Now, the depressurization of that vestibule does take quite a little bit of time. It takes about an hour, actually, to get down to vacuum, but there's going to be a check at about 5 pounds per square inch. The check at 5 pounds per square inch is going to take some time. It won't take too long to actually get to 5 psi, but once they actually get there, bringing that vestibule down to vacuum creates a little bit of temperature swings. So we need that to dampen out a bit before performing a reliable leak check. That leak check will happen at the 5 psi mark, and then we'll continue down closer to depressurization towards vacuum. Now, that's all coming up very soon. The go, no-go for actual undocking to occur a little bit more than an hour after depressurization, that at about 4:20 p.m. Pacific. And if everything goes according to plan, so far the crew a little bit ahead of schedule, we'll get them undocked right on time. We're looking at 4:34 and 58 seconds p.m. Pacific time. Everything going great so far from the International Space Station side. Now back over to you in Hawthorne.
Thanks, Gary. Now that Dragon's hatch is closed and Bob and Doug have donned their suits, we'll be looking for the APAS hatch on the station side to close very shortly. APAS is an acronym that stands for Androgynous Peripheral Attachment System. So you can see why we use an acronym, and it's an integral part of the docking system. Before closing it, we saw Chris Cassidy working to attach that docking target to fine-tune any alignment for the approaching spacecraft. So it's not something required for the undocking, but obviously we need it to be there for the next spacecraft that arrives at that port.
Yeah, and Gary had actually given us a...
Anna, I got you loud and clear. Good to talk to you again today. How's everything going?
Things are great. I'm super excited to be here.
So I think what we heard there was a comm check between the core here and Hawthorne Mission Control up to the crew. That's a very good sign. That means that they're well underway into their suit donning procedures. Suit donning just referring to getting into their suits. And one of the first steps there is checking that the microphones work both in the cabin as well as in their suits. Now, kind of what we were talking about earlier, once we get through suit donning, which will have a couple of steps involved in it, first with these comm checks, and then we'll actually do some pressure checks to make sure that the suits are leak tight. Once we get through that, then we'll actually go through a quick poll. Mission control teams will verify that we're go to depressurize the vestibule, again, which is that space in between Dragon's forward hatch and the station's APAS hatch on the mating adapter. Pressurized mating adapter on the forward module.
And as you saw, some flashes in that area down in the vestibule. That's Chris Cassidy, commander of the International Space Station, down in that space. He's taking pictures, and he'll be sending those back down to the ground team so that they can check out how the hatch closure procedure went, and he'll be able to provide those detailed photos for future use as well.
Yeah, vehicle actually undergoing a number of reconfiguration steps at this point. With crew, of course, on board, we have to make sure that our life support systems and thermal systems are all operating as nominal. And the volume actually in between in the vestibule, that pressurized area, which is now at about 14.7 psi, will actually vent that through the some vent valves on the Dragon side of the system. That's from a camera behind Bob and Doug. Bob sitting in the right hand as we see him.
Dragon in 2.5, 2 successful leak checks.
Dragon SpaceX, we see the same. Thank you.
So there's confirmation of a couple of great milestones. Forward hatch is closed, suit donning is complete. We just completed suit leak checks. Everything nominal. Bob and Doug just raising their visors, get a little bit more comfortable.
I love this view because it makes me feel like I'm in the back seat of Crew Dragon, just going along for the ride. We did have, as you mentioned, APAS hatch closure during that brief video, as well as the beginning of suit leak checks. I've got a few milestones coming up. Next, we'll be looking for that vestibule depressurization, bringing that space down to a vacuum. That should be happening very shortly, hopefully within the next 5 minutes, actually.
Yeah, so again, on your screen, left-hand side is spacecraft commander Doug Hurley. Right-hand side is spacecraft pilot Bob Behnken, and also joint operations commander. In front of them are the 3 touchscreen displays in the Dragon spacecraft. And with suit leak checks complete, the next major milestone, as you mentioned, Leah, is vestibule depressurization.
So you can see they're checking out all their screens. The crew will actually be monitoring during the departure portion of the flight. On the way up, they had a couple of opportunities to perform some manual flight tests by piloting the vehicle and checking those out and seeing how it would fly if you ever had to. But fortunately, it is an autonomous vehicle. So the goal is that the astronauts are along for the ride, there to monitor and there to step in case anything were to go wrong. But it should be an autonomous flight home. We're not stopping for any of those flight tests along the way.
That's right. Just trying to take a look here to see what the vestibule is currently pressurized at. Taking a look at the data, it's about 14.1 psi, so pounds per square inch. For reference, at sea level on Earth, we're at about 14.7 psi, and if you're about 1,000 feet above sea level, then you're actually at about 14.1. Just happened to look that up earlier today. It looks like we might have lost the camera feed, might be another handover.
Probably so. We are waiting for that vestibule depressurization to begin. We're getting calls from the crew that they're getting ready for that. So things are moving along smoothly. Everything is happening on time for an on-time departure from the International Space Station today.
Yeah, and that call will actually be the ground side. We'll do a couple of checks, make sure that we're go and all of the data and telemetry on the Dragon side of the vehicle looks good and on the vestibule sensors look good. Then there should be a call to the crew from the core letting them know that that we're planning to step into commanding vestibule depressurization. And then we'll actually issue that command. For this command, we are in joint operations. So what that means is the flight director in Hawthorne, or in Houston at Johnson Space Center, the flight director of the International Space Station has mission authority for the mission. And any commands that we want to issue to the spacecraft will actually have to get permission from the flight director. And so some of those calls will be happening in the background before we actually begin that depressurization.
Dragon SpaceX for status.
Go ahead, Anna.
The ground has verified system reconfigurations for hatch closure are complete and they are nominal. The ground will step into vestibule depressurization shortly. And finally, control of cabin air temperature via your procedure 4.080 is allowed at this point, and note that the hex is currently configured for maximum cooling.
Okay, copy all, 4.080 if we need to change the temperature. Appreciate it.
And some words going up to the Crew Dragon crew from, as you mentioned, the core, the crew operations responsible engineer here on the ground at SpaceX. They spoke with the teams in Mission Control Houston and decided, yes, they are almost ready to begin that depressurization of the vestibule. This is the exact opposite procedure that we saw on the way up. And sounds like vestibule depressurization has begun. So as we mentioned, working to bring that space down to a vacuum in preparation for Dragon to depart today. That depressurization call coming at 3:04 p.m. Pacific.
And moving pretty quickly, data shows we're currently at about 12 psi in the vestibule. Just dropped below 12, and only less than a minute ago we were at 14.1. And should only take 5 to 10 minutes to drop down to that 5 psi holding point that Gary had mentioned earlier.
And that hold will be for 25 minutes while the teams make sure the depressurization is due to the actual removal of the pressurized atmosphere and not a change in the temperature inside Crew Dragon.
Yeah, a little bit of physics there. If you expand a gas, which is what's happening here, we're taking the gas in the vestibule and venting it away, and so taking the molecules in that vestibule and sort of expanding them out, the temperature tends to drop, and so we'll want to wait for that temperature to equalize, because as it warms up, the remaining gas will bump up a little bit in pressure, and that can look like a false leak from either the International Space Station side or the Dragon side. So we give it some time to equalize the temperatures, and once we feel confident that the pressure is stable in the vestibule, then we actually perform the leak check and look to see that we don't have a drop in cabin pressure on the Dragon side, as well as a rise in pressure in the vestibule.
And things are moving quickly. We are actually already at 8.5 psi, it's pounds per square inch, in the vestibule. And as you mentioned just a moment ago, we were at 14.1. So at 8.2 now, and then we'll be waiting for that 5 psi point where we'll do that 25-minute hold.
Yeah, and kind of wild to think, among the other fun facts I was looking up, so the pressure at Everest is about 4 psi. So that'll kind of give you a sense of the pressure in the vestibule right now would be about similar to you being at maybe like 12,000 or 13,000 feet.
Yeah, and very interesting. That's near the same pressure as in an EMU, or an extravehicular mobility unit, that the astronauts use when they go outside on a spacewalk. They keep that at 4.3 psi. That way they are more able to easily move their fingers and their joints, so that work outside isn't as difficult.
Now, something interesting to note on the extravehicular, or on the EMUs. So at that like roughly 4 psi, where you're not breathing the same mix of air that you would be breathing here on the ground. Here on Earth, we'd be breathing something like 70% nitrogen and then about 20-something% oxygen. You actually need the concentration of oxygen to be higher. So when you go to those lower pressures, those suits actually transition to oxygen, right?
And taking a look at the data, it looks like we are at 5.9 psi in the vestibule. So coming up pretty soon, we should be expecting that call of having reached that 5 psi level that we're waiting for that 25-minute check. Yeah, and we heard that we're about an hour and 20 minutes from the opening of the undocking window. So they get more than one chance today to undock. On the way up, we saw the astronauts really only had that single second that they had to launch so that they would line up perfectly with the International Space Station. It's a little bit different coming home. Those burns will really be what help us line up with our targeted landing site. Right now, looking at Pensacola and a scheduled splashdown tomorrow.
There's a view on your screen. Left-hand side is the International Space Station. So that's coming from Node 2, or the forward node. Looks like Commander Chris Cassidy taking a look down the PMA and sealing up the hatch. Probably checking the seal there, it looks like.
Yeah, probably checking it for FOD, or foreign object debris, making sure that there's nothing, even a minuscule hair, that could impair the hatches from getting a good solid seal.
Right now, we're just, again, in a holding period for that vestibule depressurization, holding rock steady at 5 pounds per square inch, 5 psi. That is the final step. That is the final step, final check, really, for deep vestibule depressurization until we get down closer to vacuum. And then, of course, we have the go, no go for undocking coming up in just about an hour, and then eventually we'll get to separation. Right now, scheduled for just after 6:30 p.m. Central Time, 4:30 p.m. Pacific Time. Everything looking good from the International Space Station side of things. Again, Cassidy's duties really wrapped up for today, closing both of the station hatches. With that, we'll continue to monitor this thermal stabilization, ready to continue depressurization of the vestibule coming up here shortly. With that, we'll pass it back over to you in Hawthorne.
Thanks, Gary. Appreciate it. On your screen, a view from that camera looking at Bob and Doug's console.
So when Dragon undocks today, it'll actually weigh over 27,000 pounds. We're looking at 27,600 pounds. Of course, in microgravity, that's nearly nothing. And they'll have about 3 days worth of food and snacks on board. So we're planning on them to get home tomorrow afternoon, well, tomorrow midday for us here on the Pacific coast. And so those 3 days of food and snacks are there just in case there were to be some weather crop up that wasn't expected, and they can remain in orbit for a couple of days after undocking and be perfectly fine.
Yeah, that's right. The supplies that they have on board are really there in case we had a wave-off scenario. So if we were to have some kind of weather come in or something happen to the spacecraft where ground teams would want more time to troubleshoot and understand and see if they could recover fault tolerance on the vehicle, that would give them time to do a couple more orbits and then try again at another opportunity. Right now, vehicle looking very healthy. It's been very healthy the entire time it's been attached to station. Actually, the entire period while we were attached to space station, we were doing weekly checkouts on the vehicle of the life support system, thermal system, power system, and the prop system on board. And spacecraft has been pretty solid the entire mission.
So while we are in this holding period right now of depressurization, we're holding at that 5 psi, 5 pounds per square inch to make sure that there is no difference in temperature that's really causing that to fluctuate. A look ahead at the undocking, we are expecting to see undocking last about 5.5 minutes. And during that time, undocking for Dragon looks a little bit different than for other vehicles. When the Soyuz is on the International Space Station, it undocks by using springs that push it away from the space station. And Dragon will instead use a couple of undock burns. So 2 small, short burns, about 1.5 seconds for one of them and 5 for the other, and those will just do just enough to bring Dragon away from the International Space Station so that it can conduct its departure burns later.
Yeah, Dragon actually has 16 Draco thrusters on the base of the spacecraft, 12 in what we call the service section of the spacecraft, and 4 that would be underneath the nose cone around that forward hatch. The nose cone Dracos, the forward bulkhead Dracos, as we like to call them, are actually disabled for this portion of the mission and will be disabled for the next 3 expected burns, which would be that undock 1 burn, undock 2 burn, and then what we refer to as departure 0, which gets us on a path out of the approach ellipsoid and the keep-out sphere around the International Space Station. So these first 3 burns will actually only use the 12 service section Dracos. And we actually have that many because of redundancy on the vehicle. So we could lose certain combinations of those thrusters and still have full dimensionality control and the ability to control the vehicle's position applied thrust to it.
So if you're wondering what's keeping Dragon attached to the International Space Station right now, there are 2 sets of hooks, 6 on each side, so 12 hooks. And when that undocking sequence begins, the hooks will open and the umbilical, which provides power from the space station to Crew Dragon, that will detach, and then those short burns will fire and Crew Dragon will be on its way.
Yeah, those 12 hooks, hard capture hooks, are actually what also provides the seal as well. So they ensure that the vestibule has that leak-tight seal. And on the way up, when we docked in late May, that was one of the major milestones after we had attached, verifying that the soft capture system had completely closed and that all those hooks had driven closed.
So as you can see, NASA astronaut and commander of the International Space Station, Chris Cassidy, he's staying behind on the International Space Station for right now, and he'll return to Earth aboard a Soyuz in October. But he has just closed the Node 2 hatch. So the APAS hatch was closed earlier by Cassidy. The Dragon hatch was closed, and now just even creating a more firm seal by closing that node 2 hatch. And as you mentioned earlier, that's on the front end of the space station if it really had a front side. So that's where they are at. And you saw him taking some pictures, recording that process, and he'll be able to deliver those to the ground later for analysis and just to check out at how everything went, this first departure for Crew Dragon with a crew.
Good view from the interior of Dragon. We're looking at the pilot's side seat. So that's Bob Behnken. And you can see Doug Hurley's hands on just behind him.
Hey, Chris, that call came down on Spacey Ground 1, so I'm just going to read back on the big loop that we confirm.
And if you actually look on the right-hand...
Node 2 forward hatch and the MPEV are closed. And Chris, I owe you shortly what the undock sequence time is.
And that was a call to Chris Cassidy on the space station, checking out and making sure that they were just echoing that they saw that node 2 forward hatch closure. Things progressing well for an on-time departure. When Doug and Bob got into the spacecraft today, they had a few housekeeping things to do. They wanted to make sure those footrests that you see right there are firmly attached for the ride home. And then you can see a window over to the right of your screen. Those have had some window covers on them. They removed both of those, but they are still available so that when the crew go to sleep later tonight, they'll be able to put those window covers back up. That'll keep them from seeing a sunrise every 45 minutes or a sunset, because the space station, as we mentioned, is orbiting Earth at 17,500 miles an hour. And so they see quite a few beautiful views, sunrises and sunsets every day, 16 to be exact.
Yeah, and you can actually kind of get a sense for how bright that might be. Spacecraft and the International Space Station are currently not in the Earth's shadow, so in sunlight, and you can see how bright the window can get, almost rivaling the lights in the cabin. Now that window is actually right next to the side hatch, so you can see there's a black strip next to that window. That's actually a handrest, a handhold, and next to that is the side hatch. And that's actually what Bob and Doug will be egressing out of after they do, after successful reentry, parachute deployment, and splashdown.
Yeah, so that's what we saw the crew climb in. Once they crossed that crew access arm, that last place that they were on Earth in that white room, they climbed in through that side hatch, but that's not what's attached to the International Space Station. The nose cone on Crew Dragon opens up and, as you said, exposes those thrusters underneath, and they actually floated through that hatch. So they arrived through that one and departed through that one, but once they get back on Earth, that side hatch is the primary egress or exit from the vehicle for Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley.
Yeah, and actually one of the steps right when Bob and Doug had entered the vehicle on the launch pad was to do a leak check of that hatch. Hatch remains sealed the entire time while we're in space, and really only gets opened once we're back safely on Earth.
So pretty noteworthy about this mission, there are a lot of firsts for this mission. It's our return to flight from American soil for the first time in 9 years, since the Space Shuttle program. And it's also going to be the first splashdown in over 45 years. So actually on July 24th, just a couple of weeks ago, that was the 45-year anniversary of the last Apollo capsule splashdown with the Apollo-Soyuz test project. So it's been a long time since we've seen a crew splashdown. That typically happens with a landing. Of course, the shuttle was an orbiter and could land like a plane. And then the Soyuz, which astronauts have been arriving in for the past 9 years, that lands on land in the steppes of Kazakhstan. So this one we're looking to land in the Gulf Coast. It means a much quicker ride home for Bob and Doug once they get back.
Yeah, once we get through the Earth's atmosphere, we'll have 2 drogue chutes deploy and then 4 main chutes deploy, and then splashdown currently targeted for Pensacola, so off the west coast of Florida. And recovery actually looks a little bit different than it did 45 years ago. So we have some pretty cool recovery boats, have helicopter pads on them, as well as a what we refer to as it's as an A-arm, but it's basically a crane on the back of the spacecraft. So, excuse me, on the back of the boat. And a couple of fast boat teams will go out to the capsule, verify that it's safe to approach. Then that boat will come up, scoop up the Dragon spacecraft, put it on the deck. They'll secure everything and then open up the hatches and help Bob and Doug egress on the recovery ship.
If you've ever seen any of that old Apollo footage, the astronauts actually used to get out in the water. And so a little bit different this time. The crew will be waiting until that boat arrives with that crane to lift them up onto the deck, and they'll get the chance to get out on the boat instead of on the seas.
Yeah, and actually for recovery, we have 7 potential recovery sites, what we refer to as supported landing sites. So those are areas where a recovery team can get there very quickly, recover the crew within a couple of hours of their splashdown, but usually actually much faster than that. So we've got 4 sites in the Gulf Coast on the west, or in the Gulf on the west coast of Florida, and then 3 sites on the east coast of Florida. One of them, of course, being Cape Canaveral.
So as we were watching this past week, this tropical storm become a hurricane, there was some concern about returning today because we do have some recovery criteria. Landing in the water is a lot more difficult than landing on land because you have to consider things like wave height and wind speed. And so we are looking at those spaces in the Gulf, and they're looking pretty good compared to, obviously, the spaces on the east side of Florida. But yes, we have to take into consideration what the helicopters can arrive in and what all the boats can withstand and what the vessel, the crew capsule itself can withstand.
Yeah, that's right. The hurricane Isaias moving up, I think, the east coast of Florida now. So hopefully folks are staying safe out there. I know Doug actually took some photos from the cupola of this hurricane as it's moving up the east coast. But luckily, no major impact to weather on the west coast. Good winds, no significant lightning, no significant rain is projected for the area. And I think importantly as well, the wave heights, which are important for the spacecraft, but also for the recovery ship to be able to get close and for teams to secure the spacecraft and ensure that it's safe for recovery.
So currently we are in a hold period of the vestibule depressurization. That's the area between the hatches that the astronauts fly through or float through when they arrive and float through when they depart. So we are holding at 5 pounds per square inch for 25 minutes to make sure that checks out, and they continue with depressurization after that. But Bob and Doug, as you can see, this view over their shoulder, it makes it look like we're on the ride with them. They have donned their suits, they are in their seats, monitoring everything on those screens aboard Crew Dragon.
Why don't we actually check in with Gary at Johnson Space Center in Houston, hear how things are going on the space station side, and how do things look at Johnson, Gary?
Hey, Shiva, things are looking great here. We are also watching that vestibule depressurization, of course, complete now, holding at 5 psi. We're just looking at that thermal stabilization, just waiting for it to stabilize, balance out its swings, so we can get a nice solid leak check before continuing down close to vacuum. On the International Space Station side, we did close the A-Pass hatch, affixing that with a docking target. It's a rod with a little X at the end of it. Chris Cassidy performing those duties and taking some closeout photos, just making sure that everything was okay, checking the configuration, and that'll be reported to teams here on the ground so they understand the configuration for future crews to visit. He then loaded up that pressurized mating adapter. That was that tube that he was on the other side of which was closing the A-Pass hatch, putting some items in there for storage, and then eventually he did successfully close and lock the Node 2 forward hatch, completing his duties for the day. So he will be, of course, watching Bob and Doug depart the station. He'll be in the cupola module. This is that 7-bay window that looks right down on the Earth, provides a very good view of the Dragon departing from the forward end of the International Space Station. He'll have a camera right in his hand and be able to take some pictures as they depart the International Space Station. But the primary monitoring role will actually be in the hands of Bob and Doug, the Dragon vehicle being an autonomous departure vehicle, Bob and Doug Doug being able to take control if necessary with the monitoring role, and then the backup monitoring role here in Mission Control Houston. So as soon as we continue this depressurization of the vestibule close to vacuum, just about 4:20 p.m. Pacific time, we're looking to conduct a go, no-go. That's, I think, a little bit less than an hour from now at this time that we'll conduct a go, no-go to start the undocking sequence. So the undocking sequence will be detaching the umbilical and then releasing 12 hooks in sets of 6, 2 sets of 6. There's going to be 2 pulses that are going to be fired from the Dragon end. They're called undocking burns, and they'll actually physically separate Dragon vehicle from the International Space Station. That's scheduled just a little bit after 4:30 p.m. Pacific time today. So far, everything looking good, holding steady right now, 5 psi, looking to continue that depressurization here soon. With that, everything looking good from the International Space Station Flight Control Room. We'll send it back over to Hawthorne.
Thanks, Gary. Appreciate that update. If you're just joining us, the Dragon spacecraft is currently forward hatch sealed. Earlier today, Bob and Doug had actually loaded some powered cargo into the vehicle, and the life support system is reactivated. And then after sealing the hatches on both the International Space Station side and stepping into the spacecraft, we did some leak checks on the suits to step into vestibule leak checks now.
Yeah, and so that vestibule area, we're holding at 5 psi, 5 pounds per square inch to conduct and make sure that it is holding and not fluctuating due to any temperature changes. Actually, the crew on the International Space Station, as I mentioned earlier, this is evening for them. And so it's actually 10:30 almost aboard the International Space Station, 10:30 p.m. And so they'll be getting ready to go to sleep soon. The crew here in Crew Dragon got to take a 3-hour nap today in the middle of the day. Looks like actually the whole crew was able to enjoy that nap. That way they'd all be alert and ready to conduct these departure procedures, whether it be sealing up the hatches or conducting any of the leak checks, monitoring the ride home. We want to make sure the astronauts are well rested, and even though the crew on the International Space Station will get their sleep period soon, we'll see Bob and Doug get theirs. They'll have about 8 hours later tonight to get some shut-eye.
Yeah, that'll actually sleep shift them well before they start to step into the deorbit burn, which is actually the largest burn of the day and actually a pretty dynamic time for them. So I want to make sure that they are all well rested so they can monitor and step in if they have to take any contingency actions, and also read back on the status of the vehicle if ground control teams are unable to properly assess the health of the system. Of course, one of the nice things about having crew members aboard is they can see the health of the vehicle and they can respond. Bob and Doug able to issue commands via those touchscreen displays, and also getting quite a bit of training on potential emergency scenarios, wave-offs, scenarios where they might need to interact with Dragon and if it were to lose comms or have a thruster issue. But right now, very healthy vehicle. Haven't really seen any issues with Dragon during its 63-day stay at the International Space Station.
And if you were wondering, once Dragon departs today from the International Space Station, we're not going anywhere. We're actually going to be live all the way until they come home to Earth tomorrow. So some of the bigger things we can look forward to after undocking, we've got a couple of departure burns. The first 2 are going to bring Dragon up and over the International Space Station, and then the next 2 will bring it down and in front of the space station before a phasing burn later this afternoon to help it really sync up with its landing zone for tomorrow.
That's right. I might have heard a call.
Heard a little something.
Okay, there might be a call coming on Space to Ground. We'll be sure to keep an eye out for that.
Looks like pressure in the vestibule is still holding.
Yeah, and so as part of those burns that they have to do, the first couple of burns are really just to adjust the apogee and the perigee. So the apogee, if you can imagine the orbit of a spacecraft as an ellipse going around the Earth, the apogee is the highest point, or the point farthest away from the planet, and the perigee is the lowest point. And so right now, Dragon and the International Space Station, of course, still docked, and they're in a roughly circular orbit. After the conclusion of these departure burns, Dragon's apogee will be about 10 kilometers below the International Space Station, but we'll be slowly reducing our perigee. And then later on tonight, Pacific time, we'll actually conduct what's called a phasing burn. And the goal there is to adjust the orientation of that orbit just so we get our orbital pathway to line up over the landing site, where we will, or line up with a path that will cross over the landing site, where we can, when we issue our departure burn sequence, we'll be able to line up landing off the coast of Florida near Pensacola.
As you can see, Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley in their suits now, but after those first couple of departure burns, they'll actually be able to take off their suits, and they won't need to put them back on or don them again until tomorrow, just before the deorbit burn. And then they'll wear them the entire rest of the ride home. But for the majority of the rest of the evening after the departure burns 1 and 2, they'll be able to take off those spacesuits, relax a little bit more, enjoy their ride in Crew Dragon. And while Crew Dragon was on the International Space Station, we actually conducted some habitability tests. Of course, there's 2 astronauts flying today, but our future crews are scheduled to have 4 astronauts. So we brought in a couple of the space station's current residents to test out what it's like to have multiple people in Dragon once it's in microgravity. Performed lots of tests inside the vehicle. They had a little sleep period to see how it would be to sleep with 4 people in the vehicle, and things went pretty well. Looking forward to that first Crew 1 launch later this year.
Yeah, so right now, Dragon and the International Space Station about 422 kilometers above the Earth's surface. And going about 7.6 kilometers per second. Should be close to that 17,500 number that you probably hear pretty often.
Yes, and if you're looking at miles, it looks like we're about 261 statute miles above the Earth. And they are in the South Pacific Ocean. They'll be coming up across Hawaii not too long from now.
There's a view from the International Space Station looking at the Dragon spacecraft. So Bob and Doug inside the portion towards the right of your screen. If you can imagine how they're seating upright, their displays would sort of be looking up towards the direction the nose cone is opened up. And behind them is the trunk of the spacecraft. So that top side, the black shiny part, is actually our solar panels on the body of the spacecraft. And below that, the white side of the spacecraft is the radiator. So that's where we're radiating away our heat generated by the avionics and the electronic hardware aboard the vehicle, and of course from Bob and Doug themselves. Generating a little bit of heat based on how much physical activity and exertion they're doing. Right now it looks like they're pretty comfortable, just kind of hanging out in their suits.
And actually the vestibule leak check has started, and so they're testing to ensure the solidarity of those seals between the hatches. And as we saw earlier, they checked to make sure there was no foreign object debris or FOD, so that they would have a clean seal and be able to complete this leak check successfully, another step toward undocking.
These leak checks should be pretty fast. They'll be looking to see if there's any pressure rise on the vestibule itself, which would indicate pressure coming through the forward hatch seal.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop. Vestibule thermal stabilization is complete and the leak check period has started. Additionally, the Dragon to ground path is now available. If you would like to swap one of your audio destinations to Dragon to ground, I am happy to support a comm check at this time.
Okay, Bob will do that.
SpaceX Dragon comm checks Dragon to ground.
I hear you loud and clear. How me?
And Anna, you came in very quiet. I'll bump up that channel and maybe we could try it again.
Copy. How is this?
That's a little bit better, Anna, but got it cranked up to be able to hear you just for your awareness. A little bit different volume between the big loop and hearing you on the big loop and hearing you on Dragon to ground.
Copy. I will make sure to talk loudly into the Dragon to ground path.
And Dragon, Houston on Dragon to ground for a comm check. How do you copy me?
And Houston, we have you loud and clear on Dragon to ground.
Actually, my bad. I was not on the correct loop. Comm check again on Dragon to ground from Houston.
Okay, Leslie, we have you loud and clear on Dragon to ground. Much clearer, much less echo on this loop than the big loop.
That's a good data point, and we also have you loud and clear down here.
So we just heard some comm checks between the crew aboard the Crew Dragon and the core here on the ground, and then with the Capcom in Houston. They're two very similar positions. We call ours the Capcom because it stands for Capsule Communicator, and we are in a capsule once again. For a few years there, obviously we were flying a space shuttle, so not quite a capsule, but before that we had Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, all capsules, and this person was once used to be typically an astronaut so that they could communicate any specific details about the vehicle, especially based on their previous experience. Now we have Capcoms who are not necessarily astronauts, but obviously very, very well studied in the vehicle.
Yeah, the way we refer to them is the crew's advocate on the ground. They're trying to think of things ahead of the crew and have information that the crew might need where but they tend to act as the advocate for the crew on the ground, letting them know where equipment might be stored in the vehicle, letting them know of upcoming steps. If there's any troubleshooting that the crew need to do or information that the crew need, they interact with the crew. Typically also train very closely with the crew in simulations and also during their training periods to get them familiar with all of the procedures that they need to operate in the spacecraft. Now, during those comm checks, there was some discussion about the big loop and Dragon to ground and space to ground, a lot of different loops. Really what a loop just refers to is a communications link. Operators all have the ability to talk on these loops and provide real-time communication. Usually they are redundant loops, so if you had a problem with one of the comm systems, then there's a redundant backup so you can ensure you have good voice communication with the crew. And once we get away from space station outside of the keep-out sphere and the approach ellipsoid, we'll actually transition to what's referred to as Dragon to ground. So we'll be issuing a lot of that communication via Dragon's transmitters through those TDRS satellites back to ground.
So as we mentioned earlier, 63 days aboard the International Space Station for these two spacefarers. Was not their first flight. They'd both had two previous shuttle missions, and they both have families that are very excited to see them once they get home. I know some folks here around at SpaceX refer to them as the space dads. Both have young boys, and I know that they have to be excited to get back to their families soon.
And the space dads actually brought a cool zero-G indicator up with them. An apatosaurus, a kind of sparkly apatosaurus, who was sitting in the seat next to them for the ride up. And as I understand, their sons actually voted that that was going to be the zero-G indicator between the two of them.
They're also bringing something really interesting and with a a lot of history to it back to the ground. There was an American flag aboard the International Space Station that flew on the first space shuttle mission and the final space shuttle mission, and it was left aboard the space station. That way it could be retrieved by the next crew who launched from America, and so they are also bringing home that piece of history as well.
Yeah, so I was looking up some facts earlier. The first space shuttle mission in April 1981. So that flag has been to space quite a while, and it's been on station now for about 9 years, which is a pretty long time to be in space.
Yeah, it's probably traveled more miles than any human ever, or any astronaut ever, for sure.
So if you're just joining us, we're currently looking at 2 views inside the Dragon spacecraft. Right now in the seats are spacecraft commander Doug Hurley on the left-hand side, or in the left-hand seat, and Bob Behnken, the joint operations commander, in the right-hand seat. The crew got on board. They've had a relatively busy day packing cargo on board the spacecraft. They closed the forward hatch and the APAS hatch on the pressurized mating adapter on the International Space Station side. And they're currently in the middle of a vestibule leak check. So the vestibule, the space in between the 2 spacecraft, the 2 spacecraft being the International Space Station and Dragon. So we've brought that down to about 5 psi at this point, and verifying that there's no leakage from either side.
The International Space Station is also in the current proper configuration for that departure. They do something called feathering the solar arrays, and so what they do is they turn and lock them at an angle. That way, when Dragon leaves the space station, obviously it's going to use its thrusters, and those thrusters have exhaust that are emitted, and we don't want those to contaminate any of the solar cells on the arrays because that makes them less functional. They can't perform as well if they're coated in exhaust, and so those exhaust plumes avoid the solar arrays because they are feathered. And we also just don't want to put extra stress on the solar arrays. So it sounds like the International Space Station and is set up well for the upcoming departure of Crew Dragon.
And as kind of a preview of what's happening on the ground side, so operators and mission control in Houston, and of course operators here in mission control on Hawthorne, looking at the health of the vehicle systems. Right now we are in what are called joint operations because of our proximity to the International Space Station. And so in joint operations, the flight director out of Houston is actually the prime authority for any commanding or anything that'll occur up in space close to the International Space Station. So both teams are conducting health checks against a set of what we refer to as flight rules to check on the health of the vehicle, configuration of the vehicle, and then verifying that their procedures are go for undocking. All those checks happening concurrently with this leak check.
Yeah, and we'll be in those joint operations through the exit of the approach ellipsoid. So there are 2 invisible lines, sort of, that vehicles cross upon arrival and departure from the International Space Station, and these help us govern, we have specific rules for each one that the vehicle shouldn't cross if they violate any of those. And so some of those, for the keep-out sphere, that smaller sphere around the space station, we call that 4 orbits safe. So if the Dragon were for some reason lose control of any of its thrusters, it would be safe for 4 orbits if like not hitting the International Space Station if it's inside that keep-out sphere. And then the approach ellipsoid has a little bit of a lesser time frame. You need to be 24 hours safe. And that gives time for the teams on the ground to troubleshoot anything that might arise, as we mentioned, if there were some reason they couldn't send commands to the vehicle or the vehicle couldn't be commanded by the astronauts. So those are typically hold points on the way up for our visiting vehicles. But on the way home, we won't be stopping any. We'll be heading straight for Earth. with a splashdown planned for tomorrow.
Here's an external view of the Dragon spacecraft from the International Space Station. That structure that you see, kind of hemispherical structure on the top, is actually the nose cone. And then on the right-hand side of your screen is that pressurized mating adapter that we saw the crew in earlier. So Commander Chris Cassidy aboard the space station, closing the APAS hatch and Node 2 forward hatch on those two. And of course, Bob and Doug closing the Dragon forward hatch. And much later on in the mission, right before we are planning to step into, right before we really re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, we'll end up closing that nose cone to protect the sensors and thrusters that live underneath it.
Another thing we'll also see happen is the jettison of the trunk. And so the trunk was on the end of Crew Dragon. You could see it had the solar cells wrapped around it, helping Dragon gather power from the sun. And that'll be removed. There you can see it again. It's got some fins on it back there. That will not return to Earth with the Crew Dragon capsule. That will actually burn up upon reentry into the Earth's atmosphere. And that's where, on the way up, we would be able to store any unpressurized cargo. So if there were something that we'd like to install on the outside of the International Space Station, that would be a good place to put it. And the astronauts could use that. It's an extra trunk. I mean, it's exactly what it is. So it's not for any of their personal luggage, but it's great for any of that unpressurized cargo.
Yeah, those aerodynamic fins are actually pretty important. If there were a launch escape event, those aerodynamic fins provide stability to the vehicle as it were to separate from Falcon 9. Of course, we didn't need to see that during this mission, and hopefully we won't see that ever since the in-flight abort mission that happened. And the back on the trunk also contains the thermal coolant loops for the vehicle, so we radiate away heat to space. Of course, on planet Earth, you can sort of just push a breeze by you to get some nice cooling, but in space you have to radiate away all that heat because there's it's a vacuum around you, so you can't take advantage of convective heat transfer away from the spacecraft. Although, interesting tidbit, there is just enough of an atmosphere to be a drag, and actually the International Space Station needs to do periodic reboosts to stay in its orbit, right?
And they did one of those very recently. That was factored into Dragon's departure procedures as the International Space Station used its thrusters to reboost it, and in preparation for this October, when it will have a Soyuz vehicle arrive with some brand new crew members. And so this was factored into Dragon's departure sequence, knowing at which altitude the International Space Station would be flying. And it looks right now the International Space Station is flying 262 statute miles over the North Pacific Ocean. It looks like they will be crossing into North America soon, and specifically coming up over the coast of Oregon.
A kind of a preview of what's coming up next. Currently conducting a leak check of the vestibule. Now, particularly important because any breathable gas that you bring with you into space is what you bring on your spaceship. So the International Space Station with a supply of breathable gases, and of course Dragon with tanks aboard that contain nitrogen and oxygen, and the life support system providing periodic injections of oxygen to keep the cabin at about 20 to 25% oxygen, which is about what we would have actually here on Earth. So doing a leak check, making sure that we're not losing any of that precious breathable gas through the forward hatch seal, which has been open really this entire time while we've been on space station.
We've seen a few milestones happen so far today. Of course, we've got a lot to look forward to, but we saw the Dragon hatch close earlier after Bob and Doug were safely inside. Shortly thereafter, Chris Cassidy closed the space station side. That's the APAS hatch, and then eventually the Node 2 hatch. That allowed us to step into this vestibule depressurization period, bringing that space in between those hatches down to as close to a vacuum as we can possibly bring it before departure later later. So yes, now conducting those leak checks, and then we will be looking for a go, no go for undock coming up at 4:20 Pacific.
So during that go, no go for undocking, ground operators will be looking at the health of the vehicle systems, verifying that everything seems pressure and leak tight, verifying the configurations of both the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station. And then we'll actually expect to hear a call up to the crew, see if they're ready to come on home. And then ground operators here in Hawthorne will issue a command to the Dragon spacecraft that will begin the process of detaching the umbilicals that are providing power and telemetry from the space station to the Dragon spacecraft, and then actually removing those 12 hard capture hooks that are keeping the vestibule leak tight right now. And Dragon will do a couple of undocking burns as well, short little thrusts.
Yes, two.
From the surface section.
Very short. Will actually specifically be 1.5 seconds and then another for 5 seconds. So I think Gary described them earlier as pulses. I think that's a great way to describe them rather than necessarily as long as a burn. But even our departure burns later are short to start off with. Departure burn 0 looking to be about 12 seconds long, and then departure burn 1 for 20 seconds. And those increase the opening rate between the spacecraft and the International Space Station. And after that departure burn 1, they can take off their suits, get comfortable, and relax until time for that deorbit burn tomorrow.
Yeah, the deorbit burn is a pretty big burn, and the departure phasing burn is actually a very large burn. Departure phasing should last about 6 minutes or so, and the deorbit burn will actually be on the order of 9 to 10 minutes. Definitely the largest thrusts of at least the return portion of the mission. And for the phasing burn, that's really to line us up with our potential landing site over Pensacola in the Gulf of Mexico. And the deorbit burn will reduce our perigee, or the lowest point of Dragon's orbit, so that we end up getting caught by the Earth's atmosphere. Dragon will actually then get a chance to use its heat shield and slow down against the Earth's atmosphere. And then once we get to the right sort of pressure characteristics and altitude characteristics as sensed by the vehicle, then we'll have the drogue chutes deploy, slow us down even further before finally seeing those 4 main chutes deploy. That'll bring Dragon down to a nice, gentle landing in the ocean.
And I learned something really interesting about parachutes. So whenever you see those drogue chutes deploy, they don't automatically inflate right away. That's because they're doing something called reefing. And that keeps the air from flowing into the parachute too quickly and shocking the parachute system on Crew Dragon. So they expand very slowly and begin to slow the vehicle down rather than all at once and giving a jolt to the spacecraft.
Yeah, and actually even with the drogue chutes and the main chutes opening slowly, Bob and Doug will still experience somewhere between 4 and 5 Gs of acceleration. So 1 G is what we experience sort of just standing here. If you can imagine yourself being 4 times or 5 times as heavy just for that brief period of time, that's about how much force they'll experience. Of course, both of them test pilots. Test pilots usually train up to, depending on if you're in the Navy or the Air Force, 7 to 9 Gs. So nothing that they're probably unfamiliar with.
So you've got this really good close-up view of Crew Dragon attached to the International Space Station. That's the Node 2 forward hatch. You can see the nose cone is open. That will be closed later after the departure burn and prior to re-entry, but that is how the astronauts ingressed or entered the International Space Station when they arrived 63 days ago, and how they exited the space station when they prepare to depart today. So this is a great view, and that's where we will begin to see some movement once that undocking command is sent later this afternoon. So some more facts about our astronauts today. We mentioned that they have had 2 previous flights on the space shuttle, and this is their first flight not on a space shuttle. And so they both just logged 63 days aboard the space station. It'll be 64 by the time they return home. So Doug Hurley will have a total of 93 days in space over his 3 space flights, 2 on the shuttles, including that last shuttle mission. And then Bob Behnken will have logged a total of 92 days in space over his 3 flights. So very close there. But adding up some time aboard the International Space Station.
And Bob Behnken actually getting some pretty cool opportunities to conduct a number of spacewalks with Chris Cassidy, going outside the space station, conducting some work to replace power units and batteries on the space station.
Yes, they actually replaced some older nickel hydrogen batteries with some newer lithium ion batteries, and these upgrades have been going on for a few years now. And the astronauts were very efficient. They conducted 4 spacewalks, Chris Cassidy and Bob Behnken. And in the meantime, Doug Hurley was inside, and he was controlling the Canadarm2. That's the robotic arm on the International Space Station. And so all 3 with a very important role in those spacewalks. And it became quite a milestone for Behnken and Cassidy. They both now have conducted 10 spacewalks in their career, and that ties them with the most spacewalks by an American astronaut. They're now tied with 10 with Mike Lopez Alegria and Peggy Whitson.
Dragon SpaceX, we had a good vestibule leak check.
I can copy. It's good news. Thank you.
There's confirmation from the core of successful leak check on the vestibule. That means one more milestone down and getting ready for undock.
Yeah, and that wraps up the completion of those leak checks, as you mentioned, in that small space between Crew Dragon and the space station, the vestibule. It was brought down from a pressure of, it looked like 14.1 pounds per square inch, and then to 5. So they had that hold period and then conducted leak checks. But that 14.1 was the same as the rest of the station. Now they are offset quite a bit, and so they're going to bring that all the way down to vacuum, since that's what they will be exposed to, the hatches, I mean, once Crew Dragon Endeavour begins its journey home.
Yeah, and actually, if we didn't bring that space down to vacuum, then it would almost act like a thruster. There'd be a little bit of pressure left up in there, and so as the seals came, or as the seals were sort of opened up and we removed those hard capture hooks, we'd see a little propulsive thrust. And of course, being this close to station, we want every maneuver to be very carefully choreographed. So trying to make sure there's as little energy imparted by that little bit of pressure in the mating adapter. So actually, now's would be a great time to hear what's going on at Mission Control Houston and get an update on the space station. Gary, can you let us know how it's going?
Hey Shiva, we're watching the depressurization of the vestibule now. It's a little bit less than 4.5 psi, a little bit slower than what we saw just a little bit an hour ago when we went from about the pressure of sea level down to 5 psi. That really only taking a few minutes. This one's a little bit slower, but we are seeing a good depressurization of the vestibule, those all being controlled from the Dragon side, and we're monitoring here from Mission Control Houston. Now, some of the views you might see from the outside of the International Space Station looking at the Dragon vehicle, some of those cameras being controlled from Mission Control in Japan. Working from here in Mission Control Houston with the Japanese Mission Control Room to make sure we're going to get good views with those cameras. We're going to get a little pan as the Dragon makes its way away from the International Space Station, and that first departure burn 0, brings it a little bit faster away from the station. We'll get a nice view from the Japanese side of the International Space Station. Right now, the International Space Station configured for undocking. We do have those solar arrays feathered. That's in a locked position.
Station Houston on the Big Loop. Endeavour's undock sequence start time is planned for 23:30 GMT. That is 28 minutes from now.
You heard that from Capcom here in Mission Control Houston. That is Leslie Ringo here in Mission Control Houston. That start time is 4:30 p.m. Pacific, 6:30 p.m. Central. That is the on-time start time for the undocking sequence. Once that kicks off, that'll be the initiation of the umbilical retraction, followed by 12 hooks that are keeping Dragon in place attached to the International Space Station. Those will drive and be released 6 at a time. They're in 2 gangs. And then, of course, there's 2 undocking burns, more like pulses, just short little burps, that are going to physically separate Dragon from the International Space Station vehicle. You can hear right now everything going according to plan. We're right on the timeline. That physical separation, as long as we're on the timeline, should happen at 4:34 and 58 seconds p.m. Pacific time. Everything going well. We'll continue to monitor the depressurization of the vestibule from here in Mission Control Houston. Until then, we'll send it back over to you in Hawthorne.
Thanks, Gary. So once Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley arrived at the space station on May 31st, it did not take them long to get to work. During the time on board the orbiting laboratory, as we mentioned, Bob Behnken ventured outside the hatch 4 times for spacewalks to upgrade those batteries, and Doug Hurley used the Canadarm2 to command the station's robotic arm from the inside of the station. But when they weren't focusing on the outside of the station, they continued science and research inside the orbiting laboratory. Of course, as we mentioned, they also exercised the mandatory 2 hours each day. And many of you have seen some of the incredible pictures that they took of our home planet. This is one beautiful view of a sun glint off the ocean. And then there's also one that we have from Comet Neowise in July. If you had the opportunity to see that from the ground, we saw our astronauts had a great shot of that from the International Space Station.
Yeah, they had some really cool opportunities. We're sharing a lot of those photos on Twitter. And of course, you know, earlier this morning as they've been preparing for undocking, they had some work to do as well in packing cargo into the Dragon spacecraft. So underneath their seats, they've got room for powered and unpowered cargo. Right now, they're bringing home about 150 kilograms or about 330 pounds of cargo. Most of that is science and sampling hardware. About 94 kilograms, or about 200 pounds of it, is science that's happening aboard the space station. And Dragon does have the ability to return a lot of that cargo, so it can come back to labs here on Earth who can continue to do human science studies on those biological samples and cold sample studies on those cold samples that they're returning. And it's really something that we've been doing even since our previous version of Cargo Dragon, just continuing that capability with Crew Dragon.
Yeah, that's one thing I was going to mention. When the astronauts know that there is a Crew Dragon or a Cargo Dragon vehicle coming, they know it's about to get really busy with a lot of science. Because Cargo Dragon is currently the only vehicle cargo resupply ship we have that can bring back cargo. The others disintegrate, burn up in the Earth's atmosphere upon re-entry. So we mentioned earlier that Comet Neowise picture, and I think we have it now. Look at how beautiful that is, the comet streaking across the sky just above the Earth below. I can't imagine.
Yeah, especially to see the glow of the Earth's atmosphere kind of creating that blue sheen as the light refracts off of it. Really cool.
And this was probably taken from the cupola window, and that's, as Gary mentioned, that bay window area on the International Space Station that faces down toward Earth. It's truly the best view in the house. Chris Cassidy might head over there after undocking today to take a look outside and watch as his friends depart. We saw that on the way uphill, he was in there monitoring their arrival and taking some pictures of Crew Dragon as it arrived as well. But aside from all of that science talk, we'll also be returning some vehicle hardware like spacewalking cooling garments, which the astronauts wear under their extravehicular mobility unit suits. There's tubes of water that they can control the temperature of. So when they are in the sun outside of the space station, it can be up to 250 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow.
And when they are in the darkness and outside the space station, it can be negative 250 degrees Fahrenheit. So that cooling garment is also, in a way, a little bit of a heating garment and can help them control their temperature when they're outside on a spacewalk. So we'll be returning some of those. Also some glove connectors for refurbishment back on Earth, and along with any crew provisions like food, small electronics, and even their sleeping bags. NASA will have cargo specialists embedded with the recovery team. They'll be able to quickly recover and unload that returned cargo very shortly after Dragon returns on the recovery ship to shore tomorrow.
Yeah, and it was really interesting. You're mentioning the wide temperature variations. That's something you don't really see on Earth because we have air and we have humidity in the air that helps us sort of regulate that temperature. Of course, you don't have all that humidity and atmosphere around you to help with that. So when you're in the sun, you're getting the full brunt of that heat, and when you're not, you're getting the full coolness of being in eclipse. And so that's part of the reason why you need those extra vehicular suits, as well as like the thermal systems on Dragon, to help regulate that temperature into something that is palatable for humans.
And speaking of heat and atmosphere, when the astronauts re-enter tomorrow, they will be traveling, or they will experience temperatures up to 3,500 degrees outside the crew vehicle. Inside it'll be nice and cool. They've got some air conditioning, and their suits will have cooled air venting through them. So that's a pretty fiery re-entry tomorrow.
Another view on your screen of the Dragon spacecraft. And now looking at a camera that's positioned just behind Bob and Doug. So Doug in the left-hand seat, Bob in the right-hand seat, monitoring the vehicle. Looks like they've got the forward view, so on each of their individual panels. You can sort of tell that because it looks like they've got an attitude ring in front of them. And then they've got a view in the middle that has their procedures and cue cards up for what they can expect next. And speaking of which, actually, so then the next thing we'll really see here is final configuration for undocking. So there'll be a go, no-go poll for issuing that final configuration. We're expecting that to happen, the actual command to occur right on time at 4:30 p.m. Pacific time. And then shortly after that, we'll have a couple of those undocking bursts that will just separate any sort of friction, any sort of forces that may have statically built up while Dragon's been hanging out on station. And separation is planned for 4:34 p.m. Pacific time, 4:34 and 58 seconds, actually.
Yes, so from the time that command is sent from the ground to start undocking, as you mentioned, those hooks have to be retracted, those 12 hooks, 2 sets of 6. The umbilical that has been providing power to Dragon from the International Space Station will detach, and they will use those 2 short bursts to begin their journey home.
Yeah, and a lot of those steps are automated. Once we issue the command for undocking configuration, operators here in Mission Control will be monitoring that Dragon performs the correct state transitions. Dragon has flight computers aboard that they're triplicated for redundancy, so if one of the flight computers gets out of sync with the others, you still have the other 2 to make a good call. And of course, we have ways of resetting them and trying to understand those faults. That's part of the job of the mission controllers, to make sure they understand the health and status of the vehicle. So those flight computers will transition the vehicle through a number of states and then activate those thrusters. We'll have a couple of short bursts from the service section Draco thrusters. So those are the thrusters on the lower part of the vehicle, just above the heat shield and the trunk. And we won't be using the forward bulkhead Draco thrusters that are underneath the nose cone. So we'll see those 2 bursts that'll help take Dragon up and above, away from the International Station into a slightly higher orbit, letting Space Station move ahead.
Yes, those will be departure burns 0 and 1. Then that'll just increase the opening rate, the distance from the space station, and moving it out of the keep-out sphere, as we mentioned earlier, and eventually the approach ellipsoid. And then after it's out of the approach ellipsoid, it'll have departure burns 2 and 3. Departure burn 3, as you mentioned earlier, is like a co-elliptic burn. So it puts it on the same orbit all the way around, rather than necessarily having a widely varying apogee and perigee, or higher point of the orbit and lowest point of the orbit. Yeah,
and we were talking a little bit about the keep-out sphere and the approach ellipsoid. So those are those are imaginary spheres. The keep out sphere being a 200-meter radius, I believe, sphere around the International Space Station. So that represents a space where any spacecraft that are in those operations need very choreographed maneuvers with the flight director before they issue any commands or perform any thrusts.
Station and Dragon crew on the big loop. I want to let you know that at this time we are removing ISS power to Endeavour.
Okay.
So a call there from the Capcom saying that both the station crew and, of course, Bob and Doug no longer receiving power from the International Space Station through those umbilicals on the docking mechanism.
Yeah, so Dragon is operating on its own power, generated and gathered by those solar panels wrapped around the trunk of the vehicle. And that's actually a very similar look to the new cargo Dragon. For all of the Dragon missions until now, we saw solar wings with solar arrays, and now the cargo Dragon missions will have the solar arrays wrapped around the vehicle, just like we see here with Crew Dragon.
Yeah, and actually it's something that adds to the overall reliability of the vehicle. Anytime you have a mechanism in space that's potential for something to go wrong, you need a motor to drive it. You need checkouts potentially on the actuators. There's probably software that drives it. So having conformally wrapped solar panels around the trunk of the vehicle reduces that little bit of complexity and actually ends up being a little bit lighter too. So we can add a little more cargo and add a little bit more to other parts of the system. And on the other side of the trunk is the thermal radiator. So we've got a fluid running through that, almost like an air conditioner. And that fluid is being pumped throughout various different points in the vehicle. Actually, earlier on, we heard a call from the core mentioning that the crew could adjust the hex or heat exchanger to the position that they wanted to control internal cabin temperature. So that part of the cabin air as it goes through the revitalization system is getting passed over that heat exchanger, and that allows the crew to keep it nice and comfortable inside the cabin.
Yeah, and speaking of the vehicle, that vestibule pressure looking now at less than 0.3 PSI, so getting down there as close as it can to a vacuum. But yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that the astronauts have a flight doctor. They have somebody who's specifically assigned to them for all of their pre-flight medical and their in-flight medical and their post-flight. Somebody that is able to speak with them at almost any time and conduct health checks and just wellness checks and make sure that everything is going well while they're in this very, very rough environment of space.
Yeah, I mean, among the cargo that they have aboard is emergency medical kits and actually medical sort of medicine and like trauma kits that they would use if there were a significant medical emergency. And so the flight surgeon can help them as they're working through first aid and give them specific instructions, since if they need to do anything in an emergency scenario, it's those two taking care of each other. And of course, when the hatch was open, the entire International Space Station crew of this expedition taking care of each other. So at this point, we're about 13 minutes away from the transition for undocking, and then about 5 minutes after that, we'll have the 2 undocking burns happen, really just short little bursts from those service section Dracos. We're expecting separation to happen around 4:35 p.m. Pacific time, just a few seconds before that. Heard a go, no-go poll earlier from the mission control teams that we were talking about earlier.
So just like during its approach to the International Space Station, Dragon's departure and deorbit is designed to be fully autonomous, so it requires no action from the crew on board. Station Commander Chris Cassidy, he won't be the prime for monitoring Dragon's departure. That'll be done by the crew on Dragon. They'll be able to monitor with these screens you see here, and they'll be backed up by flight controllers on the ground. But as always, Bob and Doug will have the ability to send commands manually to the vehicle if they need to.
And once the undocking sequence is complete, Dragon will then use its Draco engines. It'll thrust away from the station in a series of pretty carefully choreographed maneuvers or 4 departure burns to increase that distance between the 2 spacecraft. And then from there, it'll perform a phasing burn that will put it on the right trajectory to get back to Earth and the landing site.
Next on its trip home is deorbit, entry and landing, and that covers all operations after the final departure maneuver. That includes trunk separation, closure of the nose cone, deorbit burn, and deployment of the drogue and main parachutes, and finally, splashdown off the Florida coast, at which point our teams will recover Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley inside Crew Dragon from the water. I just heard the call that Mission Control Houston is go
Dragon,
for undocking.
SpaceX on the big loop. The final reconfigurations for undock are complete and nominal. The ground is go for undocking at the undocking sequence start time of 23:30 GMT. Please confirm your visors are down and that you are ready for undock and departure.
Dragon copies. Go for undock on time. Our visors are down and we're ready for departure.
We copy all.
And we just heard the confirmation. Dragon is a go to undock. So now we are waiting for the undocking sequence to actually begin, and they are targeting that for 4:30 p.m. Pacific time, so it looks like 8 minutes from now. And once that begins, it'll take less than 5 minutes for Dragon to separate from the International Space Station, which has called home for 2 months now.
Now, the first step in the undocking sequence, which is, again, automatic, is for the umbilicals that are providing power, telemetry, and commanding capability between the space station and Dragon for those to retract. Once those retract, we'll actually have Dragon perform an unlatch from the space station, releasing 12 hard capture hooks that are around the vestibule. Those hard capture hooks are what are providing that airtight seal around the vestibule, and they'll actually come in 2 separate phases. So we'll hear a call for 6 of those, and then we'll hear a call for all of those being detached. And then finally, after that entire process, which takes about 4.5 minutes, then Dragon will be ready to actually depart and push itself away and separate using its Draco thrusters.
Yeah, and so Dragon's initial departure from station is a little different from any of the other docked vehicles like the Soyuz, because that relies on springs to push them away from the docking port. In this case, Dragon will actually execute those 2 short thruster firings to undock. That uses a combination of those 12 Draco engines around the base of the capsule, with the first breaking any stiction between Dragon and the docking port, and the second slowly backing the spacecraft away. And so we're expecting the call for undocking sequence to begin in the next few minutes.
And the crew aboard, they will be able to see those transitions. So what will be happening here is the flight computers on the vehicle will issue themselves into a state when that command is issued. And actually on the crew displays, on every display, they've got a prominent location that shows what the current states are. They're also able to follow along and see what the state of the vehicle is. So those are the displays that they've got pulled up on their screen right now. That middle display actually has the cards that describe what they can expect to see, along with some inline telemetry that they're getting from the vehicle directly, as well as their current positioning relative to the International Space Station. And then they've also got some views on the side that are each of them in their respective displays that are showing a forward view of the spacecraft, as well as the status of those docking hooks. At this point, the umbilicals both still installed because that command has not been issued. And the vestibule should be pretty close to vacuum.
Getting closer every second to that undocking command being sent. We're looking for that in about 5 minutes from now.
Taking a look at data here, I see the vestibule is reading as 0.1 psi. So definitely not very friendly to humans.
Everything moving smoothly throughout the day to bring us to this point with the crew ingressing Dragon, donning their suits, getting in their seats, closing the hatch, and then Chris Cassidy closing the A-Pass hatch on the station side, along with that Node 2 forward hatch, bringing that space down to as close to a vacuum as possible, and that's where we're at right now. Conducted some leak checks to ensure the seals between those hatches were solid. Everything looking good for an on-time departure today.
Pretty comfy in the cabin right now. You know, that vestibule is pretty near vacuum, but in the cabin, it's actually pretty close to what we would see at sea level, and still about 76 degrees in there. So pretty comfortable. Of course, Bob and Doug are only partially seeing that. Earlier, they closed down their visors, and so the suits that they're wearing protect them in the event of a depressurization event. They also protect them if there was a fire on board, as they're made of fire-resistant materials. And so as we're getting to this critical step of separating from the space station, if something were to go wrong here, those suits would provide that critical life support to them, pressurizing if the cabin pressure were to unexpectedly drop. It's actually part of the reason why we've spent so long in this vestibule depressurization. The operators, both on the space station side and the mission control Hawthorne side, scrutinizing the data for any indication of a leak through the forward hatch. Of course, that leak check performed earlier with no findings, showing that the vehicle is nominal and ready for undocking.
And as once we mentioned, that undocking will take a few minutes before we actually see the separation occur. But once the command is sent, those 12 latches will be retracted. The umbilical will be disconnected. Dragon is already on internal power, however. It's not receiving any power from the International Space Station. But once that umbilical is retracted, those hooks are removed. Be looking for those 2 short bursts to send Dragon on its way, and then things will speed up with those departure burns afterward. Just a couple of minutes away from that on-time undocking. That'll be 4:30 p.m. Pacific, 11:30 p.m. GMT, or the time that the astronauts use aboard the International Space Station. Looking for the undocking command to be sent in just about 30 seconds.
And again, a quick preview of what we expect to happen. Umbilicals will retract, then we'll see those docking hooks disconnect, and then we'll actually see those undocking burns followed pretty shortly after by a departure burn.
Dragon SpaceX, undock sequence commanded.
Pepper copies.
So that undocking sequence right on time.
And that was 4:30 p.m. Pacific time, 11:30 p.m. GMT. The umbilical now retracting. The International Space Station flying 263 statute miles over Namibia in Africa.
Dragon SpaceX umbilical demate complete and nominal.
There's confirmation of the umbilicals retracted, so no longer receiving power or data or commanding from the International Space Station. And there's a view on your screen of Dragon, currently in eclipse. Gary, how's it looking from mission control at Johnson?
We're looking good, Shiva. We are now inside the undocking sequence. Good umbilical retraction. Standing by for the driving of those hooks. There's 12 hooks that will be released in 2 gangs of 6. Standing by for the driving of the hooks. Here we have good motion on the primary set of hooks. Again, first set of hooks driving the navigation light, the forward end of Dragon clearly visible from this view from one of the Japanese cameras. Again, we are inside of the undocking sequence now. Good umbilical retraction, and we're driving the first set of hooks.
Dragon SpaceX, first set of hooks open and nominal.
Copy nominal hooks in the first set.
The first 6 hooks have completed their driving. First set down. The second set is now driving. We're now committed to undock. Seeing good motion on that second set of hooks. Continuing to drive. These will be the final set of hooks. There's 6 of them holding Dragon into place now. Afterwards, we'll conduct 2 undocking burns to physically separate Dragon.
Dragon SpaceX, all hooks open and nominal.
All hooks open.
Dragon departing.
Dragon SpaceX, separation confirmed.
Copy, separation
Great
confirmed.
burns. Physical separation 4:35 p.m. Pacific. Thrusters looking good. Counting down to a nominal departure burn 0 coming up shortly.
Dragon SpaceX depart burn 0 complete.
Copy complete. We're visors up.
And you heard depart burn 0 complete, that 12-second firing, moving Dragon slightly faster away from the International Space Station using those service section Dracos. And with that, Bob and Doug have concluded their stay aboard the International Space Station. They're on their way back to planet Earth. Confirms a physical separation at 4:35 p.m. Pacific as the station and Dragon were flying 267 statute miles over Johannesburg, South Africa. 2 good undocking burns and a nominal departure burn 0. Next departure burn coming up in about 5 minutes. We'll be monitoring Crew Dragon throughout the departure sequence, but with Dragon flying free, that'll do it from us here in Mission Control Houston. Godspeed, Bob and Doug. To take you through the rest of the departure sequence, we'll send you back over to Hawthorne.
Thanks, Gary. Departure burn 0 sets Crew Dragon, Endeavour, and Bob and Doug on their journey home. Dragon ship Endeavour is now on a trajectory to head up and over the station before additional maneuvers will change its orbital path to take it below and in front of the station. Dragon will autonomously accomplish that through 3 additional departure burns, with that next one coming up in just a couple of minutes to get Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley well away from the space station and on their way home.
Beautiful view. Just had a beautiful view there of the relative navigation sensors providing an infrared view of the International Space Station as Bob and Doug drift away from it. And of course, as they are drifting away, going into that slightly higher orbit, just because of balancing the force of gravity along with their centripetal acceleration, they will move a little bit slower than the space station. And so we'll expect space station to sort of drift ahead, and then as they conduct those additional burns, getting out of the approach ellipsoid and the keep out sphere, then they will come back down below space station with their apogee being about 10 kilometers below space station and slowly reducing their perigee.
Next up in just a couple of minutes, scheduled for 4:40 p.m. Pacific time and 11:40 p.m. GMT will be depart burn 1. That's a 20-second burn to further increase the opening rate between Crew Dragon and the International Space Station.
Yeah, and that view, what we just previously had, and you can actually see it on the right-hand screen of Bob's display, is a relative navigation sensor that's providing an infrared view from the forward hatch of Dragon, looking back towards the forward module of the International Space Station. So that's where Dragon has been for the last 63 days. Coming up in less than a minute is departure burn number 1. This burn coming just about 5 minutes after separation. And this is going to increase that opening rate between the space station and Dragon.
And separation occurred on time today, as with everything else occurring on schedule, sending Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley back toward Earth, back toward home.
That's a view from the space station. Those 2 lights, the green light is the view that on the right-hand side of the Dragon vehicle. That would be the side that Bob Behnken was sitting on, and the red light, the side that Doug Hurley was sitting on. It's actually made pretty quick work getting away from the station. Gonna look up some data, see if I can get the actual distance to station right now.
And departure burn 1 has begun, that 20-second burn. This will also take it outside of the keep out sphere and outside of the approach ellipsoid, and after complete.
Dragon SpaceX depart burn 1 complete. Nominal burn, you are go to doff your suits per procedure 4.012. Reminder that the ground will be deactivating the big loop following exit from the approach ellipsoid, which is approximately 12 to 14 minutes from now.
Okay. Station Endeavor on the big loop.
Go ahead, Endeavor.
Chris, we just can't thank you enough. It's been an honor and a privilege to be part of Expedition 63 with you, Anatoly, and Yvonne. It's been a great 2 months, and we appreciate all you've done as a crew to help us prove out Dragon on its maiden flight. I'd also like to thank Zeb and his team in Mission Control in Houston for the incredible amount of work they did to make the dock to op successful for Dragon, and also the teams at SpaceX that keep us going towards the end of our mission that we look forward to splashdown tomorrow. I'd also like to wish you a great success on the rest of your expedition and a safe flight home in the fall. Take care, friend.
Endeavor,
Thank
stay
you, Chris. Thank you, Anatoly. Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, Houston, and thank you, SpaceX.
Endeavor Station, Bob and Doug wholeheartedly agree with those sentiments. It's been a real pleasure. It's been an honor to serve with you. Safe travels and have a successful landing. Endeavor's a great ship. Godspeed.
Endeavor copies all. Thanks, Chris.
And we just heard some kind words exchanged between Crew Dragon and Endeavor, with Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley now on their way home.
ISS and Dragon on the big loop. Endeavor has exited the keep out sphere. See you guys when you're back home.
Endeavor copy.
Behnken and Hurley leaving behind 3 people aboard the International Space Station that will return this October. That's Station Commander Chris Cassidy, Anatoly Ivanishin, and Yvonne Wagner of Roscosmos. So, now with that splashdown tomorrow, it's looking like about a 19-hour mission for Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley from the time they undock to the time they splash down.
Of course, that time can be brought in and made a little bit shorter. For this mission, we opted to give them a 19-hour opportunity, and that gives them a chance to get some rest.
And SpaceX, say again for Endeavor.
Yes, just wanted to give you a heads up that your audio destination was on ISS, but I see you've swapped that over to ground now. We just wanted to make sure that if you were calling us, we would hear you.
Okay, Anna, thank you. I appreciate the heads up.
That fuzzy little dot is a view from the International Space Station looking at Dragon, currently on its way away from the International Space Station.
Speaking of the International Space Station, another Ask NASA question, this one from Colin, who asks, how do you keep time on the ISS? Well, you've heard us working to convert that in our heads. The International Space Station uses GMT, or Greenwich Mean Time. It's kind of the in-the-middle space between Russia and Houston, and so since those are 2 of the major partners in International Space Station operations, we use that time aboard.
Some cool views from the cameras on board the International Space Station. And one other note there, GMT is also sometimes referred to as UTC, or Universal Coordinated Time. They both mean the same thing, just slightly different nomenclature. And you may hear some of those calls over the nets and from the core.
It's now been 30 minutes since Crew Dragon separated from the International Space Station, an on-time departure. Separation coming at 4:35 p.m. Central, 11:30 p.m. GMT. It has completed its first 2 departure burns, depart burn 0 and depart burn 1. And the next will happen in about 22 minutes. We'll be looking for depart burn 2. The astronauts, Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley, are now out of their spacesuits. They won't need to put those back on until tomorrow, just before the deorbit burn.
So another question on social media right now lines up well with the view we have of Dragon. From Michelle, why is Dragon glowing right now? And actually, Dragon isn't glowing. What we're seeing is the reflection of the sun. So right now, both Dragon and the International Space Station, not in the Earth's shadow, and just from this view on the camera, compared to everything else being so dark in the background of space, Dragon is just coming out looking a little bit whitewashed, just from the exposure. So not glowing, but just seeing the reflection of the sun as we sort of adjust the white balancing. Now, actually, Dragon right now departing about 4.4 meters per second, about 3.3 kilometers away from the space station. So what we're seeing on the screen is a view from the International Space Station, and Dragon about a 5K away, or not a 5K, excuse me. That would be a 5K if it was in miles. About 3.3 kilometers away from the space station. Now, we got a question from Lucas on what the main differences are between the Draco thrusters and the other burners. And I think what Lucas is referring to here is the Super Draco thrusters. So Dragon has two types of propulsion systems on the spacecraft. We have 8 Super Draco thrusters that live in those pods on the side of the capsule. Those are only used, for launch escape. So they're pretty powerful thrusters that if we were to experience an anomaly during the ascent portion of the mission, then we can pretty much use most of our propellant to accelerate away from the Falcon 9 launch vehicle. We actually had a demonstration of that during our in-flight abort test that preceded the Demo 2 mission. The Draco thrusters are actually much smaller thrusters, and we have more of them. We have 16 of them around the vehicle, 12 of them around the service section of the vehicle that we actually have been using for all of these departure burns. And then we actually have a set of 4 of them that we refer to as the forward bulkhead Draco thrusters that are right around the forward hatch. They use a propellant called nitrogen tetraoxide as the oxidizer and monomethylhydrazine as the fuel. And those are what are known as hypergalls. So if you squirt them together, you get fire.
And we have another question from Kate, actually from her 4-year-old son, Fritz. Hello, Fritz. He would like to know if the astronauts on the space station can feel how fast they are flying on the space station or Dragon. And if not, why not? It's interesting if you think about it. The way I like to describe it is if you're sitting in a car, and let's say the car is going 60 miles an hour, you don't necessarily feel like you are going 60 miles an hour because you're essentially part of that vehicle as it moves. And so, of course, you would notice if it stopped, but as the astronauts are inside the International Space Station and it's constantly moving at 17,500 miles an hour, they do not feel that speed. And when they're outside the space station, they don't feel that speed either because there's no wind for them to feel as it moves around the Earth.
Yeah, so really if they were to feel, that's part of the fun of microgravity. Gravity is still acting on anyone who is in orbit or not, but it's really a matter of you're in a state of free fall while also your spaceship is in a state of free fall. And so you would only feel acceleration if you pushed against something or if the spacecraft pushed against you. So during those burns, actually, Bob and Doug will probably feel a little bit of thrust since they're in their seats, but otherwise not too much. And we have a question here from Glenn about if the astronauts can get out of their seats during any part of their trip home. And that's partially true. So actually during this phase of the mission, the crew are actually free to roam about the cabin, if you will. But during earlier portions of the mission, we actually had them be seated. So during the earlier undocking burns, the crew were seated. Part of the reason for that is if there was a depressurization, we would actually need them to be seated so that their suits could act as safety devices for them. And then, of course, when we get to deorbit, that's a pretty dynamic time as well, where they will be seated.
But as for this moment right now, they actually have the opportunity to be out of their seats, as you mentioned, roam about the cabin, and out of their suits as well. So they may have donned or put on some much more comfy clothes for this relaxing portion of the ride, all up until deorbit burn tomorrow.
So if you're just joining us, Dragon is on its way away from the International Space Station. We separated from the space station around 4:30 p.m. Pacific time, 4:34 p.m. Pacific time. And actually, is that right? Do I have my time wrong?
We did. Separation was on time at 4:35 p.m.
4:35, that's what I wrote.
Pacific time, and 11:30 p.m. GMT.
And spacecraft is now on its way away. We're awaiting departure burn number 2. So we've conducted 2 undocking bursts from those Draco thrusters, as well as the first departure burn and first and second departure burn. Now departure burn number 2 coming up, where it'll last about 43 seconds, and we'll use a combination of the service section and forward bulkhead Draco thrusters to reduce the lowest point of the orbit, the perigee of Dragon, get that a little bit closer towards the Earth's atmosphere.
Oh, we've got a question from Karen's 9-year-old who wants to know what the astronauts eat on the International Space Station. And they actually get a variety of choices. We have a food lab at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. And before the astronauts go on a mission, they have the opportunity to go and taste test some of their foods. And so there are a variety of types of food that are available aboard the station. A lot of it needs to be reheated with hot water. They can eat anything from at holidays, they have a lot of the same food we have down here, sweet potatoes and turkey and those kinds of good foods. They have candy like we have here on Earth, so they're not lacking on some of those sweet things. But one thing that they don't typically have are a lot of the fresh fruits and veggies that we get to enjoy. And so that's one of the things that can sometimes arrive on a cargo Dragon spaceship, and the crew loves it when it happens, but it's hard to get that food up to them just because it has to be fresh when it is packed and when it's launched and by the time it arrives. And sometimes that can be several days. So whenever they can do a late load of that cargo and get some of those fresh fruits and veggies up to them, it's always greatly appreciated. And there's always some good pictures of people juggling oranges.
SpaceX on Dragon to ground. The ground is go for depart burn 2.
SpaceX, we copy go for depart burn 2.
So confirmation there from the core and a good readback from the Dragon spacecraft that vehicle is go for depart burn number 2. That's expected just in about 12 minutes from now. And again, what we expect to happen here is Dragon will slew. That's just a term for adjusting its orientation or attitude. So there'll be a few Draco pulses to adjust the orientation of the spacecraft. And then we'll use a combination of those forward bulkhead and service section Dracos to perform this burn. Burn's expected to last about 43 seconds, and that really just that little of impulse because of the orbital altitude we're at will lower the perigee to our desired target. And then the burn after that will get us into our holding orbit below the International Space Station, where we'll be about 10 kilometers below space station before performing that final departure phasing burn for the afternoon.
And this is the third of those 4 departure burns. As you mentioned, this one lasting about 43 seconds. Depart burn 3, which is scheduled to be at 6:14 p.m. Pacific time, or it looks like 1:14 a.m. GMT. That would last about 42 seconds. So That'll be the next burn until we have the phasing burn later this evening, and then it'll be time for Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley to get a little shut-eye.
Before that, of course, they'll get a chance to have a meal aboard the space station, or a meal aboard Dragon. They've got plenty of food and water on board the spacecraft, of course, for the expected trip of this mission, which would have them landing tomorrow. They really have like meal ready to eat on board the Dragon spacecraft. We actually have a question here from the Denver OG. How many Gs do they experience on re-entry? So Gs here referring to the gravitational force that they'll experience from the re-entry forces. Took a look at the data earlier from the Demo 1 mission, as well as some of our simulations, and we're expecting the crew to experience somewhere around 4 to 5 Gs during re-entry. A lot of that will actually happen when the chutes deploy. Then on the way up, I believe they experienced on the order of 3 to 4 Gs during Falcon 9's ascent. So nothing too far out of family for the crew members.
So this view of Crew Dragon is from the International Space Station, and these cameras can actually be controlled by flight controllers in Mission Control Houston. Joint operations with Mission Control Houston have ended now that Crew Dragon is outside of the approach ellipsoid. It is entirely under the supervision of Mission Control here in Hawthorne. However, Houston is still monitoring the status of the astronauts and the vehicle. But these cameras can be controlled by teams on the ground. They help us to find what we're looking for whenever the astronauts are on a spacewalk, or to get a better view of an arriving or departing spacecraft as we have today. Crew Dragon looking pretty small compared to how we saw it just even 40 minutes ago. Just before undocking, you can see the trunk there near the top of your screen, and then Crew Dragon's capsule down at the bottom, and that's the only portion that will return tomorrow and splash down in the ocean. The trunk itself will be jettisoned and will burn up upon re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere.
We got another question from David Hernandez about if the Dragon crew vehicle will be visible from Earth. There were actually some really cool photographs when the ISS had passed in front of the sun while Dragon was attached, and you could actually make out on those photographs from a telescope the silhouette of the Dragon vehicle. I think right now, if you had a telescope pointed at the right direction, you might be able to see it, sort of depending on whether the sun was behind the vehicle or not. But definitely not visible with the naked eye. So would definitely need some help from a telescope.
And your telescope would have to be set just perfectly because Crew Dragon is still moving very quickly. Right now it looks like Crew Dragon and the International Space Station are flying 261 statute miles over the North Pacific Ocean and moving at about 17,500 miles an hour. So don't want to miss it.
So we have a question from Supermom HK fan, actually from their 5-year-old. Why does the rocket need a heat shield? And in this case, I mean, Dragon technically it does have rockets on board, although we usually refer to it as the spacecraft. But Dragon has a heat shield on board to handle the intense heat from re-entry. So as Dragon hits the Earth's atmosphere, we're going to slow it down a little bit, but we really use the atmospheric drag to slow down the spacecraft. And as the Dragon spacecraft hits into that part of the Earth's atmosphere, it'll actually compress the air and form a plasma at the base of the heat shield. And that plasma is very hot, very, very hot from the friction and compression.
Yes, and they'll reach at approximately 3,500 degrees Fahrenheit on the outside of the vehicle. That's probably not uncommon for Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley, considering they both live in Houston. They're probably used to pretty hot temperatures outside, but they'll be nice and cool inside with air conditioning, as anybody in Houston, Texas knows is a necessity.
Yeah, actually, when we get to that phase in the mission, ground controllers here in Hawthorne will do a check on the internal temperatures, potentially run some cooling, because before we get to that phase, we'll actually detach the trunk, and with that goes our ability to radiate away heat. So we'll actually do some pre-cooling on the cabin and flow some nice cool air to Bob and Doug during that pretty toasty portion of the mission.
And a cool little glimpse right here, you can see Crew Dragon and the nose cone open, and that will remain open until after the deorbit burn tomorrow. They'll be using those forward bulkhead thrusters to make that burn. It'll be the longest that we see throughout the return home to slow Crew Dragon down enough to drop it out of orbit and bring it back into Earth's atmosphere. It'll then close after that burn, and it also serves as some protection for the vehicle upon re-entry.
Yeah, it protects those navigation sensors on the top of the vehicle, the ones that we were getting those cool infrared camera views of the space station with, and what we also use for relative navigation when we're in proximity ops with the station. All of those underneath there. And actually, just coming up in about 4 minutes from now, we'll get a brief glimpse at those forward bulkhead Dracos. They'll be used during this next burn, departure burn number 2. Again, expected to last about 43 seconds to bring or reduce the perigee, get that a little bit lower.
So we'll be looking for that burn at 5:27 p.m. Pacific time, or 12:27 a.m. GMT. That is the time zone the astronauts have been used to when living aboard the International Space Station, but now that they have departed, they will begin shifting their time zone back to life on Earth and back to that of Houston, Texas, which is Central Time.
Got another question here from Kevin Shannon about who the Corps is and what their role is in astronaut and vehicle health. The Corps is a position here in Hawthorne Mission Control, very similar to the Capcom role at Johnson Space Center. Stands for Crew Operations Responsible Engineer. And really, they are responsible for understanding all of the procedures that the crew run, as well as looking out for the crew and providing them updates on the status of the vehicle. They synthesize information from the other mission controllers, as well as think ahead to things that the crew will need to know to conduct their actions on orbit and transfer that information over the comm loops. So we heard a bunch of that earlier. I think on the Capcom side, that role has traditionally been an astronaut, although that may not be the case these days.
It was at one time solely astronauts who held that capsule communicator position. Nowadays, it does not have to be. It's always, though, someone who has extensive knowledge of the vehicle or of the space station or of the task at hand. So at one time, it was always an astronaut because they do have that experience in that vehicle, but now it can be any other very experienced individual. We got another question from Dylan, who asks, I believe I heard you say there's no up or down in space. Can you explain that? Well, it's when you're in microgravity and you can orient yourself whatever which way, there's not really the same up or down as we have on Earth. I'm standing on the floor right now, but when you're on the International Space Station, that floor could also be where some of the research racks that you're working on are located, and so you just flip upside down to get better access to them. So there's not necessarily an up or down because there's that gravitational pull is not as strong there in microgravity, and so direction really goes out the window when you become an astronaut on the space station.
Of course, orientation is still very important, so we have frames of reference defined for the spacecraft. If you noticed, when we were showing views of Dragon attached to the space station, the nose cone was up, so to speak. Dragon fits to the pressurized mating adapter in a very specific way. So the guidance officer and the prop systems officer and the team here are, of course, understanding the orientation of the vehicle, but up or down is sort of a relative sensation.
And we are about a minute and a half away from departure burn 2. And this one's going to bring Dragon, it's going to lower Dragon's perigee, or the lowest point of its orbit, to below the space station. We've had Dragon above the space station at this time, but it'll be bringing it back down and in front of the space station's orbit. So it'll be a 43-second burn. And we'll be looking for that here in just about a minute now.
Really cool to still be getting these views from the International Space Station. Dragon right now is about 10 kilometers away from the space station, still retreating at a rate of 6.3 meters per second. So we probably have a pretty good lens on that camera that's giving us these views.
So a 10K. If you ever run a 10K, that's how far Dragon is from the International Space Station. And they've made pretty good time, too. They separated about at 4:35 p.m. Pacific, 11:35 p.m. GMT. So under an hour for their 10K so far. Depart burn 2 in just a few seconds. And the burn has begun. We'll be looking at a 43-second burn using a combination of service section thrusters and thrusters on the forward bulkhead, which is the area of the nose cone, or that the nose cone would be covering when it's closed.
Dragon SpaceX, burn complete, nominal burn.
Dragon copies, nominal burn.
There's confirmation from the core of a nominal burn, that burn happening just off the west coast of the United States, out over the Pacific Ocean.
And the next burn will be depart burn 3. That'll be almost 42 seconds, specifically 41.8 seconds. And that will occur at 6:14 p.m. Pacific, 1:14 a.m. GMT. It's very important to us that we keep the astronauts connected with their families. It's important for mental health, and we've seen a lot of this on Earth recently with going through the coronavirus pandemic, people being apart from each other, and we've seen people connecting virtually now more than ever. And so that's something that the astronauts have been doing for a long time, and dealing with isolation. And so we have teams on the ground that research how they are able to deal with that. And it also feeds into the future of spaceflight. You know, looking at when we go out on these missions to the moon and eventually Mars, that the astronauts will be gone for extremely long periods of time. How do we give them the opportunity to feel at home, to feel connection with people back here on Earth?
Yeah, especially interesting problem when you consider that Mars is just the light and signal delay can create either anywhere from a 25-minute delay to about a 45-minute delay, which is actually part of the reason why it's even more impressive about like Perseverance and the other Mars rovers that have to do everything totally autonomously. There's really no time for a ground operator to issue a command and then see if it worked.
And so a lot of the research we're doing on the International Space Station is paving the way for how we're going to establish a more permanent human presence on the lunar surface.
So next expected burn is departure burn number 3. That's expected at 6:14 p.m. Pacific time, or that would be about 1:14 a.m. UTC or GMT or Greenwich Mean Time. Been a pretty busy day for Bob and Doug aboard Dragon. They managed to. There's actually a view of inside the cabin. So Bob and Doug out of their spacesuits. You can actually see one of their spacesuits. It's that sort of white and gray item on the left-hand side of the screen. And then it looks like that might be Bob on the right-hand side of the screen. And we're looking at a view. You can kind of see the cargo, so the seats in front of them. Looks like they've got a spacesuit in the way of this camera. But beneath the seats, they've got some storage room where we've got about 150 kilograms of cargo. A lot of that, more than half of that actually, is scientific experiments and samples coming from the program, the research program aboard the International Space Station, which is of course a national laboratory. You actually had a number earlier. I think Bob and Doug combined had done
114 hours, approximately 114 hours of science in the lab while they were on the International Space Station. And of course, that doesn't count towards the upgrades that were completed outside with those battery changes that enable us to keep going further. But yes, it of course tripled the amount of time we were able to do because that's the U.S. lab. And Chris Cassidy was, prior to the arrival of Crew Dragon, doing all this work on his own. And so having Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley come on board for a couple of months really expanded the amount of scientific research that was conducted during that time.
Getting some cool views of the interior of the cabin. We got a sort of a sweep around of the cameras. So right now we're looking at a camera that would sit ordinarily, or sits ordinarily right behind the crew members, looking up at their displays. The view that we actually had previous to this was a view looking towards Doug Hurley's seat. And actually, when on the uphill portion of the mission, we got a quick tour of the interior of Dragon from Bob and Doug, and they gave us some insight and a quick tour of the cabin. And it looks like Bob just putting his suit away in his suit storage bag, suit drying complete. They were wearing those suits earlier, just in case they needed to. The suits really for their protection if there was a depressurization or a fire in the spacecraft. Now that we're past some of those dynamic moments close to the space station, the risk of one of those events is pretty low. The suit storage bags, though, of course, will be kept in close proximity, so if there were any sort of anomaly later on in the mission, Bob and Doug could quickly get into them. And pretty cool. They're actually pretty much a single-piece design. They can be put on within less than 15 minutes.
As you mentioned, I think you made a good call. It looked like a polo and some khakis to me, so they're now out of those suits and able to relax until before the deorbit burn tomorrow.
Probably a lot of Velcro on those as well, I'm guessing. I know on space station side, they tend to have a lot of Velcro on pretty much every surface.
Yes, it's interesting. The astronauts use Velcro on, their pant legs will have strips of Velcro, and anything that they work with, their spoon or some, like their drink bags might have a little spot of Velcro on the other side, so that way if they need to put it down, they can't really put it down, and they don't want it to float away and become lost in the recesses of the vastness of the International Space Station, and so they can just tack it to their little Velcro spot on their little pants leg and come right back to it.
Yeah, and you might wonder how something would float away. There's, actually a couple of things. One, it's really hard to impart something with no force. If you've watched videos of crew members on the space station sort of playing with their food or playing with drink bags, they might put something and it'll start to twist and turn, move, and they'll grab it, move it close to them, and it'll start to twist and move. And the other, there's actually a life support reason for doing that as well. As the crew members are exhaling carbon dioxide, unless you have really good circulation in the life support system from all the fans and scrubbers on board your spacecraft, that carbon dioxide will tend to sit and bubble and create pockets of unbreathable air. So the life support system is also providing a lot of positive pressure and moving gases around the cabin just to make sure that we are circulating and revitalizing that air, running it through our scrubbers, and of course regular injections of oxygen so it's nice and breathable.
Really cool views inside Crew Dragon. And it has now been over an hour since they left the International Space Station. So much has happened in that time with obviously the on-dock burns, the departure burns, and exiting the keep-out sphere, approach ellipsoid, the termination of joint activities between Houston and Hawthorne, and now the crew settling in for the rest of the ride until tomorrow.
Yeah, you can kind of see what we're talking about here. Is the suit helmet, sort of as Doug is putting away his suit, kind of floating a little bit. Nice, cool view into that clear visor. That visor actually creates a sealing surface as well. So those suits will keep pressure in them in the event of a depressurization.
It looks like we have a good Ask NASA question. I think it's tailor-made for you, Shiva.
Yeah, this is a good question. So a question from Anir. My 9-year-old son has a question. What is Dragon's outer layer made of, like the material you used to make it? So I think what Anir might be referring to here is our heat shield material and our thermal material. The external surfaces of Dragon are actually made of a material called pica, which I think is phenolic impregnated carbon ablator. So pica material is something that that actually NASA developed, and Dragon and SpaceX have actually done some work to upgrade it over both the crew program as well, over the cargo program and as well as over the crew program. And so we're using something called Pica 3, I believe, on the Dragon spacecraft. A cool example of kind of the partnership between the NASA teams and the SpaceX team in developing the spacecraft.
Looks like the windows outside or to the outside of Crew Dragon are a little bit dark now, and that is the case because the International Space Station is now in an orbital nighttime, or I should say Crew Dragon Endeavour, flying over the Atlantic Ocean, about 261 statute miles above us all. As I mentioned earlier, the space station orbits the Earth sees 16 sunrises and sunsets a day, so currently constantly moving at 17,500 miles an hour, and Crew Dragon is about on that same trajectory at this moment.
Yeah, again, this next upcoming burn, which is scheduled for about, let's see, 28 minutes from now. This next upcoming burn will put us into a co-elliptical orbit with the station. So all that means is the station is on a slightly elliptical orbit, mostly a circle, but not quite. And Dragon will be on a very similar ellipse to the space station, but just with its highest point of orbit about 10 kilometers below the space station. Right now, it looks like we're flying right over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, just off the, well, not quite just off the coast, west coast of Africa, but off the west coast of Africa.
One fact I love about the International Space Station, perhaps maybe not Crew Dragon Endeavour as we discussed. You might be able to see that with a telescope, but for the International Space Station, you can see that with the naked eye. You don't need a telescope. It's the third brightest object in the night sky, and so if you go to spotthestation.nasa.gov, you get the chance to see when the space station is flying over your area. So it's pretty amazing if you get the chance to look it up, and tells you when you can go outside and where to look in the sky to see the space station fly over. Every time I get the opportunity, I love to go and try and see it, and I wave at whoever is on board the International Space Station. It's funny for me to think that they're only about 250 miles above us. Of course, they're in outer space, but 250 miles is not that far when you think about it on Earth. So
that's a pretty short road trip, honestly.
Exactly.
But pretty hard to get there. Need a lot of thrust and power to get through that, and that's why we need something like Falcon 9 to be able to get us into orbit. And then, of course, once you're in orbit, that's not the end of the story. The Dragon spacecraft as well, in this case, had to provide quite a bit of thrust to then rendezvous with the International Space Station. Got a question here from Anna about how the crew can configure the capsule for sleep. So can the crew turn off the lights in the Dragon capsule to sleep? And they can, actually. As part of their sleep configuration processes, the crew can control the cabin lighting. They actually have some covers as well that they'll put on those windows. So there's 2 windows on either side of the side hatch. And of course, there's a window that looks through the forward hatch. And crew will put some covers on those just so they don't get woken up by the orbital sunrise. Yeah, of course, during that process, there was also a leak check of the suits. Bob and Doug were suited up while we underwent vestibule depressurization, and they were also suited up when we did the first of the 2 departure burns. Before that, we'd had to do a little bit of reconfiguration on the vehicle. So we had the umbilicals retract. There's a couple of power and data umbilicals, basically electrical connections that connect the docking system and the Dragon spacecraft to the systems aboard the International Space Station. We stopped providing power through those, retracted those umbilicals, and then along the vestibule, there's a set of 12 hard capture hooks. Those hooks actually provide the seal on the vestibule and keep all that precious breathable gas in there. So we detached those, and then there was 2 undock burns, very, very quick, like less than a second burns that use those service section Dracos to propel Dragon a little bit away from the spacecraft, followed by our 3 departure burns.
Yes, and all of those burns were conducted nominally. And all of them conducted on time. Everything has been like clockwork today for Crew Dragon. And so with all of those 4 departure burns complete, the next will be the phasing burn. But the crew, as you saw just a moment ago, a view from inside the cabin, they are now outside of their suits. They're able to kind of relax. There they are. It looks like Bob Behnken there monitoring and maybe even troubleshooting that little glitch he saw while monitoring the timeline. But everything moving smoothly for Crew Dragon. And in the background there, you can see Doug Hurley looking out the window. Let's see, the International Space Station is currently flying over Australia, just came up across the coast. And I'm sure it's a great view. So Crew Dragon is not too far from them because now their orbit is roughly co-elliptic, meaning they stay about 10 kilometers beneath the space station at all times.
Yeah, so Dragon right now just coming up on the west coast of Australia, and looks like they're in an orbital daytime, which you can see, and you can actually kind of get a sense for how bright it would get in the cabin without those window shades. One of the next activities that the crew will get is an opportunity for some rest. They'll get 8 hours of sleep in the Dragon capsule. And so when they do that, they'll put on some window shades just to make sure that they aren't getting that bright light from the reflection, well, from 1, directly sunlight entering through the windows, and 2, from, I'm sure, the beautiful reflection of that sunlight off the Earth's surface. And ground team's actually coordinating with the crew a little bit, so we've been hearing regular calls up from the core, the crew operations responsible engineer, up to the crew about burn performance, upcoming milestones and events. We had the crew give us a little bit of an inventory of their supplies, let us know that it looks like they got through a meal on board. And actually, that's kind of an interesting thing to talk about. So we were talking about location 9 and 23 and a couple of other locations. Dragon looks like a very, very clean vehicle on the interior, but actually behind a lot of those panels are actually stowage locations. You can actually see a couple of those here on the right-hand side of your screen. You can see that there's some stowage areas behind those panels. So ordinarily, those panels stowed inside, we've got bags designed by the SpaceX team that fit inside of them, and then inventory of supplies, water, medical supplies, of course, crew personal supplies, and food. Looks like right now Bob getting some great snaps of Australia. I'm pretty excited to see what those turn out to look like.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been very impressed with their photography skills while on board the International Space Station. And astronauts, before they depart for the space station, actually get a little bit of a photography class from our teams at Johnson Space Center. So it helps them determine a target and how to frame it, because Earth observation is a really important part of some of the research that we do. As we mentioned, it looked like earlier Doug Hurley was able to get a picture of Hurricane Isaias. And we've seen, land changes over the years from the International Space Station, tropical storms and hurricanes, and so it's an important part of what we do aboard the space station by doing those Earth observations.
And of course, also getting some opportunities to look at the heavens as well. We got some cool photos earlier of Comet Neowise from the International Space Station above all of the atmospheric distortion that you would see on the ground. Of course, when ground telescopes look at those, especially the large telescopes, they've got active control mechanisms to try to deal with the disturbance created by subtle motions of the Earth's atmosphere. But if you can put a telescope above the Earth's atmosphere, then you don't have to deal so much. with those disturbances. So Bob and Doug, where they're at, pretty thin on the atmosphere, and able to get some great photos of Neowise as well.
Taking every second they get to take a look outside of the windows, some last views from orbit before returning to Earth tomorrow. So Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley are riding right now in the Crew Dragon Endeavor. Not a lot scheduled for the next few hours except their crew sleep period, which will come up at, let's see, well, they'll get a pre-sleep opportunity to conduct any of those nighttime routines they might have at 7:40 Pacific, and then they will go to sleep about an hour later. And then we'll be looking for the next burn. That'll be the biggest one we've seen so far, taking place at 10:48 p.m. Pacific, and that is 5:48 a.m. GMT. So that's the phasing burn. We will be looking forward to that. The crew will already be asleep, and that burn will last over 6 minutes.
It's a pretty big burn as well. It's what gets the spacecraft aligned on the right trajectory for the landing site. Again, our primary landing site is off the coast of Florida, the west coast of Florida, and the Gulf of Mexico. That'll be near Pensacola, Florida. And we've got a backup site near Panama City in Florida. And so those burns pretty important to get Dragon aligned on that. Dragon will be coming up on what's called an ascending trajectory. So they'll stow those either in the seat buckets, or actually they can stow and secure their sleeping bags below the seats over the cargo and kind of spread out and get some space. But from what I hear, both options are pretty comfortable. And it was actually kind of interesting looking through the training. We had actually done some demonstrations of that with some of our engineers and crew members up in our capsule simulator, getting some shut-eye to demonstrate that you could sleep in the capsule.
And it's funny, one of the things that the astronauts really get a choice of on the space station is they have those cutouts for their arms. And some people like to strap their arms down because in microgravity, your arms just naturally float up to this, about this area, halfway up, kind of looks like a zombie state. So crew members have the option if they want to strap their arms in and snuggle up, or they can just let them float free. This question from Inulia, wondering if the muscles of the astronauts weaken after their trip to space. We do a lot of counteractive measures while the astronauts are in space. One of those being they typically, or they work out 2 hours a day every day. We have a couple of different exercise devices up there. We have a treadmill, and of course it's kind of difficult to work out in space. You can't run on a treadmill like you would on Earth because you just bounce right off, and so they have bungees that they attach to that keep them pulled down and running on that treadmill. We actually had an astronaut run the Boston Marathon while in space once, so that was impressive. And then additionally, they have something called the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device, or the ARED, and that can be configured for a lot of different exercises. Anything you can think of. They can do squats with it, bicep curls, they can even do crunches with it. And so by using all of these exercise devices, they also have like a little bicycle on the space station, or the stationary bike. By using all of those, we help keep their bone density strong and their muscles strong, so that when they can return to Earth, they're strong and they're able to get back to normal life pretty quickly.
Yeah, and actually, it's that's an interesting point. So I think a lot of people, when they think of lifting weights on Earth, You lift a weight and it's heavy, and you exercise your muscle groups and go through whatever repetitions you need to work on your physical fitness. But of course, in microgravity, any action that you want your muscles to act against needs some kind of resistive force, because your weights would be free falling with you, and so they'd effectively weigh nothing. And that's actually part of one of the cool reasons why Bob and Chris Cassidy were able to move around those massive many 100-kilogram battery assemblies on the exterior of the space station. If you're all falling at the same rate, then you don't have to worry about the carrying it. So on the ARED, it's a resistive device. You've almost got like resistive bands, if you will, that are counteracting the motion of the crew's muscle. And so when they're exercising against that resistance. Some really pretty views from the interior of Dragon. Looks like we might actually have a call here from Bob shortly.
And SpaceX Endeavour, could you secure the cameras, please?
And by secure, you mean go external on the cameras?
Yep, that would be great.
Consider it in work.
So of course, we can move the camera views from interior to exterior. We saw a little bit of that earlier today.
Oh, there we got a nice view of Bob and Doug in their suits. This is the first time we've seen them in their suits and in their chairs this morning. So there they are, tapping away, preparing to initiate the deorbit sequence. So let's talk a little. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, just like in the lead up in the last couple of minutes, we heard they had good suit leak checks. As Kate described earlier, once the leak checks are complete, they don't keep the suit pressurized, so visors are open. They're going to have cool air running through their suits and the cabin and just getting ready for the ride.
Yeah. Whenever they are re-entering the atmosphere, the external temperature will reach about 3,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The internal temperature of the cabin, however, will stay around 85 degrees Fahrenheit. We have a couple of systems in place to keep it cool and comfortable for Bob and Doug as they are returning. Like Dan just said, there will be some cool air flowing through their suits. The cabin itself will also be purged with cooler air as well. So that will assist in making sure that the temperature stays pretty temperate inside the capsule.
And I mean, we're just 42 minutes and 50 seconds away from things really kicking up. And this is going to be when we really start to do that first maneuver to get ready to jettison the trunk. And then we'll do that claw and trunk separation. And then it's time for just kind of that final firing of those engines, that really just that downhill ride.
Yeah, those forward bulkhead thrusters, there are 4 of them, 4 of those Draco thrusters there at the top of the capsule near the nose cone. Those will be utilized to perform the deorbit burn. This burn is what will essentially give Dragon its final trajectory back home. This is the last burn that the capsule will perform. If you've been following along since yesterday afternoon, you know that there have been a number of burns completed. This deorbit burn will be the final one. It will last about 11 and a half minutes. After that burn completes, we no longer need to utilize those Draco thrusters, and we want to protect the forward hatch up there, so we close the nose cone and lock it up. We're expecting that event to happen at 11:11 a.m. Pacific. About 10 minutes, or excuse me, 20 minutes, 25 minutes, wow, mental math on air is hard. 25 minutes after that, the capsule will be re-entering the Earth's atmosphere, and like I mentioned, approaching about 3,500 degrees, and that's because
we're in that heat of re-entry, and so that's where things will really heat up for Bob and Doug on their re-entry, and that's where we'll have that comms blackout. And we actually have a Twitter question that's germane to this right now, where Stephen asked, during the blackout, will you not be able to communicate with Bob and Doug, but you will be able to track them? And it's kind of a mix. We won't be able to talk to Bob and Doug. We won't be able to send or receive any data from the Dragon spacecraft. So we won't have basically telemetry-driven tracking, but we know exactly where they're going to be as their orbit's already been calculated. We've had this orbit calculated since yesterday, essentially. It's gotten fine-tuned as we've done those burns, but we'll know exactly where they're supposed to be, even though we can't communicate during that time.
Exactly. And even though we won't be able to send or receive signals or commands or telemetry, Dragon is designed to be fully autonomous. At that point, it is driving itself anyway, so there's really nothing to be worried about. Bob and Doug's primary function at that point is to monitor all of the telemetry that they see on their screens and to stay comfy.
Yeah, and once they're through that, that initial entry, we'll have that part called entry interface, which we kind of explained as that's when the capsule's really experiencing aerodynamics. They've been flying around in the vacuum of space with no air, so no lift, drag, stuff like that on their capsule. And entry interface is where they're really starting to hit the atmosphere, and it's affecting the capsule. And it'll continue to use its Draco thrusters on the service section to really guide it back home.
Yeah, exactly. So speaking of guiding it back home, here come the parachutes. At 11:44 a.m. Pacific or 18:44 Universal Time, we're going to be deploying the drogue parachutes. Drogue chutes are utilized for a couple of reasons. One, to continue to further decelerate the vehicle and also to stabilize it. Like Dan said, it will be experiencing some of those aerodynamic pressures, and so we want to make sure that the capsule is well and stable before we deploy the main parachutes. Those main chutes will be deploying at 11:45 a.m. and there will be 4 of them. Those will essentially deploy, and it takes a couple seconds for them to fully inflate. So it might look a little funny at first, but we assure you that they are working properly, and it just takes a couple seconds for the air to continue to catch in them and for them to fully expand to their large, rounder shape. So after those chutes deploy, it only takes 3.5 minutes for Bob and Doug to splash down. That'll be occurring at 11:48 a.m. Pacific, 18:48 Universal. And like we've mentioned before, our splashdown location is off the western coast of Florida. We're aiming for a location near Pensacola. Our recovery vessel Go Navigator is currently in location, ready and waiting for splashdown. They're actually going to be waiting about 3 nautical miles away from that splashdown point.
Yeah, we got the call that they were on station. We also got the call that the NASA WB-57 airplane is in the air, and we've actually seen a couple of brief spurts of video. That's the airborne asset that we'll have. That WB-57 is a high-altitude research plane that NASA flies. It's outfitted with a number of imaging cameras. The main one that will be seen is an infrared one. If you watched the Demo 1 splashdown, which I'm sure you all did, you were able to see that first, and this is actually a glimpse of that WB-57 camera. We'll be getting this back, and if we acquire it the same time we did for Demo 1, we were able to see the capsule while it was still in that atmospheric reentry, so it was just this really bright light that all of a sudden lit up the sky, and that was the first view we got of Dragon. And so we'll use that to hopefully see during the entry, and then the initial parachute deploys, and then we'll have a couple more assets on the ground or on the water, on the boat, that will get a couple more views of Dragon as it delivers Bob and Doug safely to the ocean.
Yeah, so as you can hear, all of this excitement will be happening in pretty rapid succession. On your screen now, we can see closest to the camera, we have NASA astronaut Doug Hurley. He is the pilot or the commander for this particular mission, and then there now on the camera to the right is NASA astronaut Bob Behnken. We are very fondly looking forward to bringing our space dads home this morning, and it looks like we mentioned before, that'll be happening in about an hour and a half. Again, targeting splashdown for 11:48 a.m. Pacific, 18:48 Universal Time. But like we mentioned before, the action really begins at the claw separation milestone, which is slated for 10:51 a.m. Pacific in about 38 minutes from now. So again, we are continuing to take questions this morning through Twitter using the hashtag #AskNASA. Our next question comes to us from F1 Fanatic. Do the astronauts need to have face masks down during reentry? That is a great question. Very astute observation that those visors are in the upward position. So right now, these suits are unpressurized and Bob and Doug are breathing just the normal cabin air. Those face masks, or visors as we refer to them, do need to be lowered and locked during the reentry period. We need the spacesuit to be fully enclosed during the more dynamic elements of operations, and certainly the reentry period is one of them. So we'll actually at one point during the deorbit burn preparation phase, we will actually hear communication between ground station, from ground here, mission control headquarters at SpaceX to Bob and Doug, just to confirm and double check that those visors are in place where they should be. Our next question comes to us from Philip. Where exactly are the parachutes stored before deployment?
They are stored in two separate compartments on the Dragon spacecraft, on a side of the vehicle that has a deployable panel. The drogue parachutes are stored in the kind of the upper part. It's called the upper bulkhead, and they're deployed by two drogue motors or mortars. So pyrotechnics that are fired to actually deploy those drogue parachutes. Just further down the panel, kind of at the base of the spacecraft, is where the four main parachutes are stored. And again, those get drawn out by the drogue chutes. There are redundant systems in place to make sure that if the first set of mortars don't fire, you have backups to get these chutes deployed. We're one fault tolerant on both the drogue parachutes and the main parachutes. So 1 out of 2 drogues and 3 out of 4 mains is what the vehicle's been rated and tested to. SpaceX has done a tremendous amount of testing on these parachutes, even within just the last several months in the lead up to the mission. As parachutes, obviously a very critical part of the reentry, and this is something that is very meticulously packed and documented before the start of any mission. And NASA assisting SpaceX, as we have some experts who have been involved in parachute missions for decades. But the parachutes are stored under deployable panels, and we'll see them basically fire open as the parachutes come out and deploy at the different altitudes.
Yeah, those panels are basically located above and below the side hatch panel. So if you are looking at the Dragon capsule, the anchor point for those parachutes will ensure that the side hatch will effectively be as far away from the ocean surface as possible, ensuring that we're able to expedite the process of egressing Bob and Doug from the capsule and the whole recovery process as a whole. Great question.
All right, our next one comes from Scott. He wants to know, what are the tablets on their legs used for? What kind of devices are they? I think you've heard him call out a few times that they're using iPads on board, and they're really just essentially their user manuals. They're able to dial up different procedures, checklists, things that they're looking for throughout their flight. They're able to Velcro them essentially to their suits, and just like the main displays in front of them, they're touchscreen enabled, and they have the touchscreen capable gloves in their suits.
As our views here of the capsule cycle through, we'll be able to see what their screens look like. There we go. So there in the center screen, we actually have the ground tracking map. As you can see there, actually it might be kind of hard to make out, but Dragon is actually crossing over the Atlantic Ocean, now approaching what looks like England and Ireland. So it will be crossing over into Europe soon. And also on those screens to the left and the right of that ground track screen were their telemetry screens. So those will be the interface that they use during the deorbit burn, and that's what they'll essentially use to make sure that everything is looking good and performing nominally.
Yeah, and I mean, that center screen that you just saw, that's essentially the same map that we've been looking at throughout our coverage here today. So they're looking at a lot of the same data that we're trying to give you guys down here on the ground. Just where are they over the Earth? Because it can be a little disorienting to look out the window and figure it out quickly. but they're able to see just how far along their orbit they are, where those milestones are coming up. So they can just, again, they're in a monitor mode and they're ready, locked and loaded to jump in if required. Our next question comes from Roshan, who 7-year-old Ian wants to know, why is the Dragon capsule cone-shaped? For a very specific reason, and it's why a lot of spacecraft are in the capsule shape. When they were trying to really figure out the most efficient way to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, both from handling the trajectory without having wings like a space shuttle, starting over. When they were really first trying to figure out how to best shape a spacecraft to efficiently and effectively re-enter the Earth's atmosphere in the safest configuration, where they essentially landed on was a cone shape. Or a capsule shape. There were very initial drawings that you could find all manner of spacecraft that were put into wind tunnels, but at the end of the day, all the way back in the early days of spaceflight, when we were in the Mercury and the very early days, they were able to determine that the capsule shape was really the most efficient. That shape of heat shield dissipated the heat the best, was the easiest to control, and was really the safest option. And physics haven't changed since the 60s, at least not a great deal. So that's why you still see a lot of capsule-shaped spacecraft, and it's really just for re-entering an atmosphere. Good question.
So there on your screen, again, we have live shots coming from Dragon Endeavour as it is making its way back towards Earth. We are approaching the final steps of the day, of the mission, in fact. And at 11:48 a.m. Pacific, 18:18 a.m. or p.m., excuse me, Universal, we will have the splashdown of Dragon Endeavour. So right now, Bob and Doug are essentially cycling through, preparing for what we call deorbit burn initiation. This will be where the deorbit burn is what will be placing Dragon on its final trajectory to a specific landing location. That location there were 7 possible ones. We determined the best one for today's re-entry to be off the coast of Florida near Pensacola. The recovery vessel Go Navigator is in place, ready and waiting. And it seems like Bob and Doug are pretty comfortable there. They are in their spacesuits. The leak check has been performed, and we got the call out that it was nominal. So everything good there. Right now, those visors are in the up position. They will be closed and locked whenever we get into the dynamic portion here upcoming in just a few minutes. Checking my timeline here.
We're just about 24 minutes and 20 seconds from things really picking up. That's when we'll start to get into the attitude to separate the trunk, and just about 8 minutes after that is when we'll start the deorbit burn. And again, that'll be the longest burn of Dragon's return journey. The latest timeline we got had it lasting for about 11 minutes and 22 seconds. It'll be the last firing of those forward bulkhead thrusters. The 4 Dracos at the very top of Dragon that'll eventually be covered up by the nose cone following the deorbit burn. And as we've said before, that deorbit burn is what commits them to coming home. When that happens, that capsule is re-entering the Earth's atmosphere, and that'll put them essentially on a collision course with planet Earth. It lines up their orbit to intersect with that splashdown point in the Gulf of Mexico. while we have just a few more minutes until we get to that, we still have some questions coming in. Again, if you have one, jump over on Twitter, use the hashtag AskNASA. This one comes from Scare Survivor, who wants to know, does Dragon lose radio data contact with satellite or ground stations during re-entry? And the answer is really everything. As that plasma builds up around the spacecraft, it essentially prevents signals being sent or transmitted or received by Dragon's antennas around the outside of the spacecraft. So it's both satellites and ground stations that it won't be able to communicate with. But again, Dragon continues flying itself. We know what its orbit is plotted out to be, so we know where it is, and we even know the expected time of that comm blackout in about 6 minutes. So it does lose contact with everything. We won't be able to hear from Bob and Doug until they're on the other side of that blackout, and then we'll reestablish communication with Dragon. All right, we have another one from Nettie Banda. Wanted to know how many seats are in Dragon.
So as you can see on your screen there are actually, I guess one is hidden, there are actually 4 chairs there. And then we will begin a deorbit burn a couple minutes later. That deorbit burn is slated to begin at 10:56 a.m. Pacific, 18:56 Universal Coordinated Time. So in just under 23 minutes, we're expecting that to start. Once again, if you're just joining us, we've got some live views inside the Dragon Endeavour capsule. Bob and Doug there in their seats as they are making final preparations and doing final reviews as we get ready to initiate the deorbit sequence. Closest to the camera there is NASA astronaut Doug Hurley, and further away from the camera is NASA astronaut Bob Behnken. These are 2 incredibly wonderful humans. We affectionately call them our space dads here at SpaceX. It's been such an honor to be able to fly them. Of course, Doug Hurley was actually the pilot of the final space shuttle mission, STS-135, back in 2011. And honestly, when I heard that he was assigned to this mission, I cried because, just to have the opportunity to return the pilot of that final mission to the space station in this capacity is so cool. And I've loved following this mission since the moment that we started training for it here in Hawthorne.
Well, we know that they're ready. They've done all of their suit checkouts, everything to get themselves to this point. And once we begin these events, they're going to keep a very close eye, as again, crew is always in the loop to step in. But Dragon going to be executing all of these different maneuvers and separation events automatically via a pre-programmed timeline. We're continuing to count down. We'll have our first maneuver in a little under 13 minutes. We're a little over 15 minutes from the claw separation. That claw connecting the service module to the Dragon capsule itself. A series of quick disconnects will retract, cutting off any of the fluid and data paths between the two. And then shortly after that, just a few seconds later, the trunk will separate. And then we will be just less than 5 minutes away from that deorbit burn. Again, deorbit burn expected to last 11 minutes and 22 seconds.
Now, of course, during re-entry, Bob and Doug will be experiencing a couple of Gs. We're anticipating them to feel about 4 Gs during re-entry. This will make it a little difficult for them to move their arms around. Not impossible, but essentially what they're doing right now is reviewing all of the event details for splashdown, making sure that and I've said this before, they have rehearsed this both they've rehearsed the sequence of events in person with the recovery team, as well as through simulations here at Mission Control, or at SpaceX headquarters in Hawthorne, California. So at this point, because it will be difficult for them to maybe flip through to the exact part of the procedure they might want to review during the actual re-entry event itself, they are reviewing those now in preparation for that splashdown, or for the re-entry sequence.
We've got another Twitter question. This from Laura Mountain. This one's pretty cool. Is it quiet in the Dragon, or does it sound like an airplane? Well, it doesn't sound like an airplane, at least not right now, as they're still flying through the vacuum of space. There's none of that rushing air. They'll get some of that once they're further down during their descent. And then they're also able to hear when the Draco thrusters fire. And one of the really cool things they've done to train the crew is SpaceX had a number of microphones placed throughout the cabin during that Demo 1 flight last year. And they were able to record what it sounded like inside through all of the major burns, the launch, the descent and landing, everything. And in the trainer upstairs here at Hawthorne at SpaceX headquarters, they have speakers set up where, as they're doing simulations or practice runs of the different phases of the mission, they're able to hear what it should sound like inside Dragon as they're going through that. So I know that's one thing Bob pointed out is one of the things they're looking for is, does this sound like I was expecting it to? Does this look like, is that a light I'm supposed to see? All of those different things that for them is like reflex by the time they've trained it this much. All right, well, at this moment, we are less than 10 minutes away from this sequence starting. We are just about 9 minutes away, in fact. And first, we'll see that maneuver where we'll get in the proper attitude or point Dragon really in the right direction for the claw and trunk separation. We're essentially going to do a 90-degree yaw maneuver, turn Dragon sideways to make sure the trunk goes out and away, not coming out in front of or behind the capsule, essentially re-entering the atmosphere with the capsule. We're going to avoid that. And then Dragon will position itself for the deorbit burn. It's going to point those forward bulkhead thrusters into the direction that it's currently traveling. This is called a retrograde maneuver, and this is done specifically to, we're going to slow the capsule down, but more than anything, we're changing the perigee, or the lowest point of the capsule's orbit. Again, essentially putting it up on an intersection point with that spot in the Gulf where we're coming home. "8 minutes, Kate."
We are getting close